Have you ever wondered what life was truly like for the women? Victorian England called fallen, those who walked under the dim and flickering haze of gaslight, their shadows stretching long over cobbled streets, their laughter and quiet, negotiations lost beneath the clatter of carriage wheels and the distant chime of church bells. Imagine listening to this in the small hours, perhaps lying in your bed with the covers drawn close, or sitting by a rain-fogged window, your room dim except for the warm glow of a single lamp. I invite you to wander with me into a time when London's heart beat to a rhythm of strict manners by day and restless, secret appetites by night. Make sure you're subscribed to our channel so you can join me on nights like this. And tell me, are you listening from London, Lahore, New York, or perhaps from a little town whose quiet streets hide stories of their own? Tonight's journey takes us through the forgotten lives of women whose existence was both denied and depended upon by Victorian society. They were the unseen yet vital threads in the tapestry of the city's night's prostitutes, streetwalkers, brothel workers, terms spoken in whispers during the day. Still, they lived in full during the hours when respectable Londoners shut their doors and pretended the fog erased what they didn't wish to see. In the 19th century, prostitution was neither rare nor hidden. It was as much a part of London as its market stalls and its docks, woven into the city's economy, its gossip, and its sense of itself. The moral code of the era demanded a facade. On one side, rigid rules about female purity, modesty, and domestic duty. On the other, a thriving underground of sexual commerce that stretched from the cramped rooms of Whitechapel to the velvet-draped parlors of Mayfair. By day, the neighborhoods where much of this life took place seemed almost deserted thin light filtered through mist, the sound of a lone costermonger's cart rattling along a wet lane. At night, they transformed. Lamps hissed and flared as the lamplighters made their rounds. The mist took on an amber glow, and the streets filled with a slow-moving crowd. Men seeking company, women offering it, beggars calling out for coins. The occasional patrolman's boots ringing on stone. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of damp stone, coal smoke, beer spilling onto wooden floors, roasting chestnuts from a street brazier, and the faint sweetness of cheap perfume. Many women, this life began not by choice, but by force of circumstance. The death of a husband or father could mean the loss of the sole breadwinner, leaving widows and daughters to fend for themselves in a city that offered few respectable jobs for women, and even fewer that paid enough to survive. Some came from the countryside, lured by promises of work as seamstresses or servants, only to find themselves without wages, without protection, and deep in debt to a lodging housekeeper or an employment agent who found them work in the streets instead. Others entered the trade as a temporary escape from starvation, telling themselves it was only until they could save enough to do something else. But the street, once entered, had its gravitational pull. The routines, the dangers, the odd companionships all became part of a rhythm that was hard to break. The streets became home and prison in equal measure. A typical evening might begin with small rituals. In a cramped rented room, a woman might pin her hair in place with care, though the pins were old and the comb was missing teeth. She might sew a torn seam in her dress or line the hem with a strip of ribbon salvaged from a discarded bonnet. A few drops of scent sheep, sharp, and floral would be dabbed at the throat or wrists, not to mask anything, but to suggest a touch of refinement. Then out into the night she would go, stepping carefully to avoid the muck that collected where the gutters overflowed. Position mattered. Standing too close to a rival could invite trouble, but being too far from the main flow of customers meant earning nothing. Some worked in pairs for safety, watching each other's backs when a client seemed drunk, angry, or otherwise dangerous. Others preferred solitude, claiming a certain stretch of pavement as their own. The men who sought them out were as varied as the city itself. Some were dock workers just paid their week's wages, smelling of tar and salt. Others were soldiers. On leave, their uniforms lending them a kind of swagger that often masked loneliness or homesickness. Wealthy men came too, merchants, lawyers, even minor aristocrats, often cloaked and hat-brim low, wishing to remain unseen. In the more expensive brothels, clients might be politicians or foreign diplomats, their visits a mixture of indulgence and political intrigue. The encounters themselves could be swift and businesslike, or oddly tender, a sharing of stories and drink before anything else. For some men, the draw was not simply the physical act, but the chance to be listened to without judgment, though, of course, judgment was often there, hidden behind a mask of courtesy. The law cast a long shadow over all of this. Under the Contagious Diseases Acts, police had the authority to detain women suspected of being prostitutes in certain districts and subject them to invasive medical examinations. The stated aim was to control the spread of venereal disease among soldiers and sailors, but in practice, it punished women for the actions of their clients, branding them publicly and often destroying any hope of returning to respectable life. Refusal to submit could mean imprisonment, and even those who passed an examination might find their names recorded in police registers, making them vulnerable to further harassment. The police themselves were a paradox, sometimes violently hostile, sometimes quietly complicit, accepting bribes to look the other way, or even arranging favors in exchange for leaving a woman alone. For all its risks, this life held moments of levity and resilience. Laughter echoed in narrow alleys when two friends shared a joke about a particularly foolish client. Women pooled coins to buy a round of drinks at a gin shop, singing softly to the tune of a fiddler in the corner. On rare nights, a man might leave not just payment, but a small gift, a hair comb, a scarf, a box of sweets that was treasured for months. Even the smallest kindness stood out against the backdrop of daily struggle. But danger was never far. A wrong client, a bad temper, a hidden knife violence could come without warning. Many carried their small weapons, a hatpin, a piece of lead sewn into a hem, a sharpened spoon handle. The city itself seemed to conspire both for and against them. Fog provided cover from prying eyes, yet it also hid danger. The glow of a gas lamp might make a face appear more beautiful, but it could also reveal a scar or a bruise. Music drifting from a public house could be welcoming, or it could signal a crowd too drunk to be safe. For the women, every night was a calculation. How to earn enough without drawing the wrong attention. How to read the faces of strangers. How to disappear into the crowd when needed. Their lives were a constant negotiation between visibility and invisibility, seen enough to work, unseen enough to survive. These women were part of London's living memory, though history often erased them. Their footsteps wore the stones of alleys smooth. Their voices, though rarely recorded, shaped the language of the streets. They navigated a world that condemned them in public, yet sought them in private, a world that offered neither justice nor mercy in any reliable form. To understand them is to understand the city itself, not just its grandeur, but its contradictions, its hypocrisies, and the human cost beneath its elegance. And yet, as we walk further into this story, know that what we have seen so far is only the surface. The real secrets, the private rules of the street, the alliances and betrayals, the strange blend of danger and opportunity, wait just ahead. In the next turn of the road, in the next quiet exchange, under a lamp whose light reaches only so far, the street never truly slept, though its pace changed with the turning of the hours. In the early part of the evening, before the theaters let out and the public houses began to spill their patrons into the lanes, the work was slower, the air holding an expectant hush. Women might linger at their favored corners, chatting softly with one another, sharing a small flask, or leaning against a doorway while watching for the first wave of potential customers. The gas lamps hissed faintly as they burned, the light pooling on the wet cobbles and catching the glint of a boot buckle or the sheen of damp hair. Every sense became part of the trade learning to recognize the hurried step of a man avoiding trouble, a confident stride of one seeking it, the nervous glances of those afraid to be recognized. For the women, these were signals, the language of the street that determined whether they would approach or remain still. Some had mastered a kind of silent theater, the lift of an eyebrow, the slow turn of the head, the shifting of weight from one foot to the other, all subtle invitations, imperceptible to the casual passerby, but clear to their intended audience. Others relied on more direct methods, calling softly, letting a scarf slip from one shoulder, humming a few bars of a familiar song. The streets were their stage, and each night they performed, adjusting to the shifting mood of the city dot as the evening deepened. The clientele changed. The first wave often consisted of working men spending their wages before too much of it disappeared into household expenses or drink. They came in groups sometimes, laughing and calling to one another, though they often separated quickly when it came to making arrangements. A man might pause by a lamppost, pretending to light a cigarette, while casting sidelong glances at the women waiting nearby. A brief exchange of question, a nod, a gesture would be enough, and the two would melt away into a side alley or a rented room. For some women, this part of the night was about making enough quickly to meet the rent or buy food for the next day. For others, it was simply a warm-up for the more profitable hours ahead. Theaters in the West End and music halls across the city would soon release their crowds, and among them would be wealthier men who could afford the higher rates of a brothel or the services of a woman who worked from her room rather than the street. These encounters were different: more time, more money, sometimes more conversation, though the dangers remained the same. Brothels ranged from the barely furnished rooms above a gin shop to elaborately decorated houses with parlors draped in velvet and candles burning in polished sconces. In the better establishments, the madam played an important role, controlling not only the finances, but also the flow of clients, the health of her workers, and the delicate balance between satisfying customers and avoiding police attention. A good madam could protect her women from some of the worst dangers. A bad one could exploit them mercilessly, taking the lion's share of their earnings and leaving them vulnerable to abuse. In the poorer brothels, the line between worker and prisoner blurred. Women might be locked in, their debts to the madam growing faster than they could be repaid, the promise of freedom always just out of reach. Yet even here, bonds of loyalty could form, women sharing what little they had, tending to one another's injuries, hiding one another from violent clients or vengeful pimps. Health was a constant and pressing concern. Diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea were common. There, symptoms feared not only for the physical pain they caused, but for the visible marks that could end a woman's ability to work. Medical care was expensive and often dangerous, with treatments ranging from mercury ointments to harsh internal washes that did as much harm as good. The Contagious Diseases Acts loomed over everything, and a woman suspected of being infected could be forcibly examined, an ordeal that was both humiliating and terrifying. Some women sought out clandestine remedies from sympathetic nurses or herbalists, trading services or goods in exchange for tinctures, poultices, or advice whispered over a cup of tea. Others simply worked through the illness, concealing symptoms as best they could, knowing that a single visible sore might mean the loss of all income. The emotional toll was harder to measure, but no less real. Some women kept a mental wall between themselves and their clients, treating each encounter as a purely practical exchange. Others found it harder to avoid the small connections that could form a shared laugh, a story of a family far away, a moment of kindness from an unexpected source. These fragments of humanity were double-edged. They could make the work more bearable, but they could also open the door to hurt when the inevitable separation came. The knowledge that a man who had spoken tenderly the night before might pass. In the street the next day, without even a glance, was a wound that no amount of coins could heal. In between the clients and the waiting, there were moments of strange stillness. A woman might lean against the wall of a building, feeling the cool dampness of the stone through her dress, watching the fog drift in slow curls along the ground. Somewhere, a distant church bell might chime the hour, the sound softened by the charm. Night air. A cat would slink along the edge of the street, its fur beaded with moisture, vanishing into the shadows as silently as it had appeared. These were the moments when the city felt almost like an ally, its vastness offering a kind of anonymity, its darkness a cloak that could be drawn tight around oneself. But the same darkness could hide danger, a shape moving too quickly in the fog, footsteps following too closely, the sudden silence that meant the street had emptied. These were warnings that could not be ignored. Violence was always a possibility, and women developed instincts to sense it before it came too close. A certain set to a man's shoulders, a change in his tone, the smell of too much gin. These were all signs to be wary. Some carried small weapons. Others relied on speed, on knowing the quickest way to a familiar doorway or the path to a constable. Who might help? There were stories whispered among the women, tales of those who had disappeared without a trace, of bodies found in the river, of murders that the papers barely mentioned. Such stories became part of the city's undercurrent, known to those who lived its nights, but invisible to those who only saw it in the daylight, not despite the danger. Some nights ended well. A good run of clients, a few extra coins tucked away, the warmth of a meal shared with friends in a quiet back room. These small victories were enough to keep going. There was laughter too, real and unforced, when a friend recounted a particularly absurd encounter, or when the group teased one another about a man's clumsy attempts at charm. These moments were precious, a reminder that even amid hardship, joy could find a place. But joy was fleeting, and the next night would bring its challenges, its dangers, and its own stories. And as the night wore on, the work shifted again. The late hours brought a different crowd, those too drunk to be cautious, those who came looking for trouble, those who could not go home for reasons they would not share. For the women, this was the most dangerous time, when judgment was dulled, and tempers flared easily. It required all their skill to navigate, to earn what they could, while avoiding the kind of encounter that could end in injury or worse. They became masters of reading the street, of knowing when to engage and when to disappear into the shadows. This life was not simple, not a matter of vice and virtue, as the moralists liked to claim. It was a constant balancing act, a negotiation, with the city itself. And if you think you now understand the full measure of their nights, you are mistaken, because what happened behind closed doors, the hidden rules of the brothel, the whispered agreements between women, the unexpected alliances and quiet betrayals, tells an even deeper story, one that the streets alone could never reveal behind. The street's thin veil of flickering lamplight and damp fog lay. The world of the brothel, a space both more sheltered and more dangerous than the open cobbles. The brothel was a microcosm of the city's contradictions. It could be a refuge from the unpredictable violence of the street, a place with walls, warmth, and some measure of control, but it could just as easily be a trap where debts, rules, and the will of the madam closed in like a set of invisible bars. Stepping through the door was stepping into another layer of the city's life, one where the air was heavy with the mingled scents of candle wax, old wood polished to a shine, perfume both cheap and expensive, and the lingering traces of wine and tobacco. In the better houses, the front parlor was arranged like a scene from a fashionable drawing room, plush chairs in faded but elegant fabrics, lace curtains carefully drawn to hide the street, a fireplace with a small coal fire that snapped, hissed as though performing for the guests. The lighting was soft, meant to flatter faces and smooth out the flaws in a dress or complexion. The shadows arranged almost like furniture themselves, providing privacy where needed. The madam was the sovereign of this little realm. Her word carried weight, not just within the house, but in her dealings with other madams, with the police, with certain clients whose patronage could mean protection or ruin. Some were shrewd businesswomen, managing the accounts, negotiating terms, with clients ensuring their women were healthy enough to work, keeping trouble away as best they could. Others were exploiters of the cruelest kind, keeping their workers in perpetual debt with inflated charges for rent, clothing, food, and fines for imagined slights. In the worst houses, the women were little more than prisoners, their movements restricted, their earnings swallowed almost entirely by the house. But even in such places, a strange hierarchy existed, with senior girls sometimes mentoring the newer ones, teaching them the unspoken rules that might mean the difference between a safe night and a dangerous one. There were rituals here, just as there were on the street. The brothel's evening might begin with a kind of informal parade, the women gathering in the parlor when a client arrived, each showing herself in the light, making small talk while the madam discreetly guided choices with subtle nods or a hand on a client's arm. Conversations were often part performance, the women adopting different personas depending on the client's desires, a witty and worldly confidant, a shy and demure companion, an exotic stranger with a rehearsed backstory. These roles could be swapped in an instant, the shift of a smile or the lowering of a voice transforming one identity into another. For some, the acting became second nature. For others, it was a mask that grew heavy with time. The clients themselves brought their layers of complexity. In the higher class houses, one might find gentlemen of means who came not just for the physical act, but for the atmosphere, the sense of being in a place where the rules of society bent and softened. They might spend hours drinking brandy, smoking cigars, and talking about politics, business, or scandal before disappearing upstairs. Others came with specific tastes or fantasies, some harmless, others less so. In lower-class brothels, the clientele was rougher laborers, sailors, soldiers, and men on the run from debts or the law. Encounters here were often briefer, less talk and more transaction, though even these could contain moments of unexpected connection or cruelty. Payment was its ritual. In better houses, it was handled discreetly. The money passed to the madam before the evening began. In poorer places, payment was often in cash, handed directly to the woman, though she would be expected to surrender a large portion to the house. Afterward, some clients tried to bargain, to extend time without paying more, or to offer goods instead of coin jewelry of dubious value, clothing, even promises of future patronage that rarely materialized. The women learned quickly how to judge a client's sincerity, when to press for payment, and when to cut an encounter short before it cost more than it earned. But money was only one form of currency here. Information was another, and sometimes the most valuable. A client might speak too freely after a drink or two, revealing business secrets, political gossip, or private indiscretions. Such knowledge could be traded between houses, passed quietly to the right ears, or kept for leverage if the client became troublesome. The women themselves often became quiet repositories of the city's undercurrents, holding fragments of stories that, if pieced together, could map the hidden flows of power and influence in Victorian London. The brothel was also a place where danger could arrive without warning. A jealous lover might burst in, a drunken client could become violent, or a police raid might scatter everyone into chaos. In some districts, the police worked hand in glove with the madams, warning them of raids in exchange for favors or payments. In others, the raids were genuine and brutal, intended to make an example. For the women, the key to survival was readiness knowing which door led to the back alley, which window could be opened quickly, where a weapon or a friend might be found. The bonds formed between women in these houses could be deep, born of shared risk and the constant need to watch one another's backs. And yet, within these walls, moments of comfort and even joy could still bloom. There might be a quiet afternoon, before the evening's work, with women sitting together in their nightdresses, sewing, sharing tea, telling stories that mixed truth and invention so seamlessly they could hardly be separated. On a rare slow night, someone might produce a deck of cards, or a battered piano might be played, the room filling with laughter and song. These moments were fleeting, but they were precious, a reminder that even here, life was not only hardship. The brothel could never be entirely trusted as a haven. It was a place of constant calculation between safety and freedom, between earning enough and keeping one's dignity intact, between the friendships that made the nights bearable and the rivalries that could make them dangerous. The rules were unspoken but rigid. Never undercut another woman without cause. Never speak openly about a client's secrets. Never forget that the madam's favor could vanish as quickly as it was given. Breaking these rules could mean being cast out onto the street with nothing. Or worse, the brothel's doors might close to the street, but they could not close to the realities of the world outside. Disease, poverty, and the ever-present judgment of society seeped in through every crack. Women who aged out of the work or fell ill often found themselves with nowhere to go, the brothel no more willing to support them than the city was. Charitable. Institutions might take them in, but these were often more about moral reform than genuine care, imposing strict rules and offering little real help. Many ended their days back on the street or in the dreaded workhouse, stripped of what little independence they had managed to carve out. To understand the brothel is to understand another layer of the forgotten lives we are tracing, a layer hidden from the casual passerby, where the rules of the street still applied, but were reshaped by walls, candles, and the watchful eyes of a madam. Yet even here there was another, more secret space, a place beyond the parlor and the bedrooms, beyond the reach of most clients, where the women kept their truest selves and their deepest secrets. It is into that hidden heart of their world, the private rooms and the whispered pacts, that we must now step. Beyond the parlors, where clients drank and laughed, past the creaking staircases worn smooth by countless footsteps, and behind doors that no gentleman was ever invited to open, there existed the brothel's true inner chambers, private spaces where the women lived, prepared, recovered, and sometimes plotted. These were not the staged rooms with velvet curtains and flickering candles meant to charm visitors. They were the working heart of the house, where the raw reality of the profession unfolded away from the curated elegance of the front rooms. The walls here were close, the ceilings low, the air thick with a mix of stale perfume, drying laundry, spilled gin, and the faint metallic tongue of coal smoke from a grate that never quite managed to warm the whole space. The floors creaked with every step, and the furniture was mismatched and scarred from years of use yet for many of the women. These cramped quarters were the only consistent shelter they had known in years. Each woman's small space often, no more than a bed, a trunk, and a narrow strip of wall, was both deeply personal and profoundly temporary. On the wall might hang a faded ribbon, a photograph of a child sent away to relatives, a scrap of lace saved from a client's gift, or a religious icon tucked discreetly into a corner. These items were talismans, fragments of identity that anchored them amid the constant churn of faces and nights. Privacy was rare. Curtains might be hung between beds, or thin partitions set up, but sound traveled freely, and there was no avoiding the knowledge of each other's moods, arguments, and illnesses. This closeness bred both fierce loyalty and simmering tension. In the good moments, the women were each other's family braiding hair before a night's work, lending a dress for a particular client, sitting up late to talk in whispers when one was too restless to sleep. In the bad moments, rivalries flared into open hostility, fueled by competition for high-paying customers, or the madam's favor. The daily routine here was shaped by the rhythm of the house. Afternoons were often quiet, the rooms dim and still, the women sleeping off the previous night or tending to the maintenance of their appearances. Hair was washed in tin basins, with water hauled up from the kitchen, dresses mended with needle and thread, and shoes polished until the leather shone. Those who could afford it might send garments out to a seamstress or buy cosmetics from a traveling peddler rouge in tiny pots, kohl for the eyes, powders to soften the skin's shine. These preparations were not vanity alone. In a profession where first impressions could mean the difference between a night's wage and going hungry, every detail mattered. Evenings began with a subtle shift in energy. Voices grew livelier, laughter bubbled up from the kitchen where a meal might be hastily shared, and the air filled with the scents of soap, perfume, and hot irons as curls were coaxed into place. There was an unspoken ritual to these hours. The older, more experienced women would watch the younger ones, offering tips on handling certain clients, warning them about others, passing along bits of knowledge about who was generous, who was cruel, and who might have connections worth cultivating. These exchanges were part of a survival strategy as much as they were acts of kindness. In a world where official protections were nearly non-existent, wisdom passed from woman to woman was often the only defense available. Yet behind the camaraderie lay constant negotiation with danger. The inner rooms were where women patched each other's wounds after violent encounters, where whispered accounts of assaults or thefts were shared, and where plans were made to avoid a man known to carry a knife or one who refused to pay. Sometimes the madam intervened, barring a dangerous client from returning other times. Especially if the man was wealthy or well-connected, she turned a blind eye, leaving the women to fend for themselves. This reality bred a kind of hardened pragmatism. Many of the women kept small weapons hidden in their rooms, a hatpin tucked into a pillowcase, a length of chain beneath the bed, a shard of glass wrapped in cloth. It was not paranoia. It was preparation. Illness was an ever-present threat in these quarters. The damp air and close living conditions bred coughs and fevers, while the more feared affliction syphilis, gonorrhea crept through the house like shadows, striking suddenly and without mercy. Remedies were shared quietly. Herbal infusions, mercury ointments despite their risks, strange concoctions bought from street sellers who promised miraculous cures. Some women relied on old folk remedies passed down from their mothers' or grandmothers' garlic. Hung in the room, poultices made from mustard seed, salt carried in a small pouch for protection. Whether these worked or not, they offered a measure of comfort in a world where the official medical system often treated such women with contempt or outright cruelty. The private rooms also served as spaces for secrets that had nothing to do with illness or clients. Here, letters were written sometimes to children being raised far away, sometimes to sweethearts or family members who believed the writer worked respectably as a seamstress or domestic servant. Small hoards of savings were hidden in unlikely places, sewn into hems, tucked into the lining of a mattress, concealed inside an old teapot. Dreams were spoken of here too, in the hushed voices of women who imagined saving enough to open a shop, to return to the countryside, or to leave England altogether for a fresh start in another land. These dreams were fragile, often deferred by the demands of survival, but they were not entirely abandoned. Not all the secrets kept here were hopeful. There were also alliances with dangerous men, arrangements with corrupt police officers, and debts to moneylenders that could never quite be paid off. A woman might find herself trapped in a web of obligation owing favors to a client who had helped her, bound to a madam who claimed she could not be spared, indebted to a pawnbroker who held the last piece of jewelry from her mother. The inner rooms were where such deals were made, where whispered bargains sealed fates, and where escape plans were formed and sometimes abandoned. Occasionally, these hidden spaces bore witness to acts of defiance. A woman might refuse a client outright, knowing it would cost her a night's wages, but unwilling to endure his cruelty again. Another might slip out through the back door and vanish for days, reappearing with no explanation, but a spark of independence in her eyes. Such acts were risky, often punished, but they served as reminders that even here, under the weight of rules and expectations, there remained a flicker of personal will. If the front rooms of a brothel were about presentation, and the parlors about negotiation, the inner chambers were about endurance, the quiet, stubborn survival of those whose lives balanced constantly on the edge of danger. Here, away from the gaze of clients, they were not performing. They were simply existing, in all the complexity and contradiction that life allowed them. Yet even in these private quarters, another layer of secrecy lay beneath, one that linked the brothel to the streets to the wider city, and the city to a network of women whose stories rarely reach the surface. It is into that network, those unseen connections that bound together women across districts and circumstances, that we must now follow. The network that tied together the women of Victorian London's sex trade was invisible to most, yet as real and intricate as any web spun in the city's rafters. It stretched from the alleys of Whitechapel to the polished doorways of St. James, from the cramped rooms of riverside lodging houses to the discreet upper floors of music halls, and it was held together not by formal agreements, but by a constant flow of whispered news, warnings, and opportunities. A woman who knew the right people could find work in a new part of the city within a day of being turned out from her old haunt. Another, desperate after a run of bad nights, might receive a quiet word from a friend about a visiting merchant with a heavy purse and a taste for certain company. These connections were built in the back rooms of gin shops, over shared cups of tea in lodging houses, and in the hushed moments between clients in a brothel's upstairs corridor. Trust was always provisional. Everyone had to earn their place. In the web, but once established, it could mean the difference between surviving and vanishing into the city's darker currents. Not much of the information that flowed through this network was about safety. Which streets were being patrolled more heavily this week? Which constables were in the mood to make trouble? Which clients had turned violent? Which madams were shorting their workers on pay? A single warning, passed from woman to woman, could save someone from a beating or an arrest. There were also alerts about disease outbreaks, rumors of a man carrying the signs of syphilis, of a house where 2 women had fallen ill in quick succession. These whispers traveled faster than the official channels of public health, for the women knew they could not rely on the authorities to protect them. In a world where the law itself was often a predator, self-protection meant relying on one another. But the network was not only about caution, it was also about opportunity. Women shared tips on wealthy clients who were generous tippers, or on events that might draw crowds with money to spend: the opening of a new theater, the arrival of a ship in the docks after a long voyage, a political meeting that would leave its attendees eager for diversion. Some even pooled resources to hire a cab together, traveling to parts of the city where the night promised better earnings. These ventures were calculated risks, requiring both knowledge and courage, for moving into a new district meant encroaching on someone else's territory, and territorial disputes could turn ugly quickly. Lodging houses played a key role in this unseen web. Scattered throughout the city, they offered beds for the night at rates that ranged from barely affordable to extortionate, and they served as hubs of information. The landladies, usually women themselves, often acted as informal brokers, introducing newcomers to potential clients, arranging meetings, or warning tenants away from dangerous situations. Some were genuinely protective, especially toward younger women, while others exploited their tenants as ruthlessly as any brothel madam, demanding a cut of their earnings or threatening to throw them out without notice. In the common rooms of these houses, the stories of the night before were traded like currency, with every detail weighed for its potential use. The city's music halls and public houses formed another layer of connection. Many women worked as barmaids or entertainers alongside their street or brothel work, using the position to meet clients in a setting that offered at least a thin veneer of respectability. The music hall, with its bright lights, bawdy songs, and lively crowds, was a place where deals could be struck in plain sight, the transaction masked as casual conversation. A knowing glance, a whispered remark, a drink bought and accepted, these were the signals that set arrangements in motion. Regulars came to know the rhythms of the place, the nights when the best patrons appeared, the corners where a private word could be exchanged without drawing notice. Beneath the hum of opportunity and survival, there was a darker side to this network. Pimps and criminal gangs also moved within it, seeking to control and profit from the women's work. Some offered protection real or claimed in exchange for a share of earnings. Others used threats and violence to maintain control. Women who resisted could find themselves harassed, beaten, or worse. In some districts, the gangs and the police operated in uneasy partnership, each taking its share from the same source. Navigating this landscape required constant vigilance and a finely tuned sense of judgment, for the wrong alliance could end a career or a life. Despite the danger, the network also nurtured acts of quiet heroism. A woman might hide another from an enraged client or an abusive pimp, risking her safety. Others helped sick friends by covering their place on the street or slipping them part of their night's earnings. Sometimes the network reached beyond London itself. Letters would arrive from women who had moved to other cities or even abroad, sharing news of conditions there, advising on whether it was worth making the journey. These correspondences were treasured, passed from hand to hand until they were too worn to read, their words carrying the sense of connection across distance and time. The role of discretion within this web could not be overstated. Secrets were its lifeblood, and keeping them was essential. A woman who betrayed a confidence, who gossiped about a client's private habits or another woman's earnings, could find herself quickly isolated, cut off from the flow of information that kept her safe. Conversely, a reputation for trustworthiness could open doors to better work, safer arrangements, and alliances that lasted for years. This unwritten code of silence was one of the few protections they could claim as their own, and breaking it was among the gravest of offenses. In a city as vast and restless as Victorian London, this hidden network was both fragile and enduring. It shifted constantly, adapting to new dangers and opportunities. Yet its essential purpose remained the same: to help its members navigate a world that saw them as disposable. Its lines of communication ran through whispers in the fog, glances across crowded rooms, folded notes passed hand to hand, and the unspoken understanding that survival was a collective endeavor. But for all its reach, there were limits to what it could do. The network could offer warning, guidance, even moments of sanctuary, but it could not erase the deeper threats that stalked these women, the structural forces of poverty, law, and prejudice that shaped their lives. And as we follow the thread deeper into their world, we will find that there were other, more personal dangers waiting beyond the public gaze: the tangled relationships with clients, the shifting boundaries between business and intimacy, and the risks that came when the two began to blur. And that is where we will go next. If the network of women, madams, and sympathetic landladies provided a loose scaffolding of survival, the real unpredictability, and often the most dangerous entanglements came from the relationships with individual clients. These connections, sometimes fleeting, sometimes strangely enduring, occupied a complicated space between commerce and companionship, between the strictly transactional and the unexpectedly personal. For many clients, the exchange was simple: money for time, an unspoken agreement that ended as soon as the door closed behind them. But others sought something less tangible and far more unpredictable. Some men returned week after week, choosing the same woman, not because she was the most beautiful or the cheapest, but because she listened, because she remembered the small details of his life. After all, in her company, he could shed the skin of who he was outside. For the women, these regulars could be both blessing and burden. A steady source of income, yes, but also a potential source of jealousy from others, and a risk if the man became possessive or imagined the connection was more than it was. The dynamics of such relationships could shift rapidly. A regular might begin by paying generously, leaving small gifts, a scarf, a book, a box of sugared almonds, and speaking of the woman as though she were a friend. Over time, he might grow more controlling, asking her not to see other clients, offering to keep her in a private lodging. For some women, this was an attractive proposition. Being kept by one man could mean financial stability, a safer working environment, and relief from the nightly uncertainty of the street. But it also meant dependence, and dependence could turn to vulnerability if the man's money dried up, if his affections cooled, or if his possessiveness turned violent. Stories circulated in the network of women disappearing into such arrangements and later reappearing, penniless and bruised, their former benefactors having discarded them without warning. Others found themselves entangled with clients who brought danger of a different kind. Some used their positions of influence to avoid payment or repercussions for bad behavior. Policemen, minor officials, even members of parliament who frequented discreet brothels in the West End. These men understood the power imbalance and exploited it, confident that their victims' words would carry little weight if accusations were made. A few women tried to use the information gleaned from such encounters as leverage, but blackmail was a perilous game, and those who played it risked retaliation that could be swift and brutal. Not all complexities came from cruelty or exploitation. There were also cases, rare but memorable, where genuine affection developed, where the line between work and intimacy blurred into something that neither party fully controlled. A woman might find herself laughing more freely, speaking more openly, feeling moments of warmth that seemed out of place in a profession built on pretense. But such feelings were double-edged. They could soften the edges of the work, making it easier to endure, but they could also lead to heartbreak when the man returned to his respectable life, leaving her behind with only the memory of what had felt, for a brief time, like something real. The quiet grief of these partings rarely showed on the street, but in the privacy of a back room or the pages of a hidden letter, the loss could be felt keenly. The financial aspect of these relationships was rarely straightforward. Even with regulars, payment was expected, though it might come in less obvious forms, paid to the landlady, a new dress purchased just because, or groceries delivered to the door. Some women skillfully balanced a handful of such arrangements, ensuring a steady income without tying themselves too closely to any one man. This required tact, discretion, and a constant awareness of the shifting currents of jealousy and rivalry, both among clients and among other women in the same house or district. A careless word could unravel months of careful management, costing not just income but safety. The settings for these encounters varied widely, each with its risks and benefits. A meeting in a rented room offered privacy, but it also left the woman alone if trouble arose. A brothel provided the presence of others, but at the cost of the madam's cut and the risk of interference. Some meetings took place in the back rooms of taverns or in the curtained boxes of music halls, where a brief touch, a whispered suggestion, and a quick disappearance could set the terms for a later rendezvous. In summer, there were even open-air encounters in secluded gardens, along the darkened stretches of the riverbank, or in the quiet corners of parks after the constables had moved on. These carried their hazards: discovery, robbery, or simply the chill of the night air. The emotional labor required to navigate all of this was immense. A woman had to gauge a man's mood within moments, adjusting her tone, her body language, even her level of eye contact to suit his expectations. She had to remember his stories, his preferences, his dislikes, while keeping her boundaries intact. She had to conceal fear when she felt it, offer sympathy she might not feel, and create the illusion of intimacy without letting it consume her. This was work as surely as any factory shift, requiring skill, stamina, and constant vigilance. Yet it was rarely acknowledged as such by those outside the trade. And yet, amid all this calculation, there were nights when something unexpected broke through a shared joke that lingered after the door closed. A song hummed together in the half-dark, a silence that was not awkward, but companionable. These moments could be dangerous in their way, planting seeds of sentiment in soil where they were unlikely to grow. But they could also be small lifelines, reminders that even in a world built on transactions, the human need for connection could not be entirely extinguished. Still, the balance between connection and caution was fragile, and tipping too far toward either side could bring ruin. A woman who became too emotionally involved risked losing her judgment, putting herself in harm's way for the sake of someone who might not return the loyalty. A woman who kept herself too guarded could lose the clients who valued warmth and responsiveness, shrinking her pool of work. The skill lay in walking the narrow path between, and not every woman managed it for long. As we follow these connections further, the next step leads us into the spaces where intimacy and power collided most dangerously. The hidden rooms where clients with influence shaped the fates of the women they visited, and where the decisions made in whispered conversations could ripple far beyond the walls in which they were spoken. The rooms where influence and intimacy collided were not always grand, but they were always charged spaces where a woman's livelihood could be secured or destroyed in the span of a single evening, where decisions whispered over the rim of a glass carried consequences far beyond the night itself. In the upper floors of discreet West End houses, the clientele included men whose names appeared in the newspapers, members of Parliament, barristers, wealthy merchants, foreign envoys, and occasionally even minor aristocracy. These men often came cloaked in the careful manners of their public roles, but behind closed doors, the tone shifted. Some sought the company of women who would flatter and indulge them, allowing them to escape the burdens of status. Others sought the thrill of bending rules in spaces where the law's gaze was conveniently absent. For the women, these visits could mean higher pay and a degree of protection, connections that might ward off police attention or open doors to more lucrative arrangements, but they also carried unique dangers. A careless word about a man's habits could find its way into the wrong ears, and in a city where reputation was currency, such slips could invite swift and brutal reprisal. The negotiations in these rooms were often subtle and layered. A man might present himself as a generous patron, offering gifts and favors, while quietly seeking to shape a woman's choices, where she worked, whom she saw, even how she spoke to others. Some women navigated these attentions with practiced skill, taking what benefits they could while resisting deeper entanglement. Others found themselves drawn into a kind of private service, visiting the same man in his home or lodging, effectively becoming his mistress without the title or security. The distinction between this role and being kept was narrow, but the risks were the same: dependence, isolation, and the possibility of sudden abandonment if the man's situation or affections changed. Political and commercial intrigue sometimes bled into these encounters. A client might use a brothel's privacy to meet with associates, discussing matters that could not be aired in gentlemen's clubs or offices. The women present were expected to be silent witnesses, pouring drinks, offering smiles, and pretending not to understand the details. Yet many listened closely, storing away fragments of information that might one day serve as leverage. There were stories half legend, half truth of women who sold such knowledge to rivals or the press, changing the course of business deals or political debates. But the danger of such dealings was immense. Those caught in the act could disappear from the city's streets without a trace, their absence noted only in the quiet shifting of the network's whispered warnings. Not all influential clients wielded power through wealth or office. Some were enforcers for criminal gangs, their authority measured in the fear they inspired rather than in social standing. These men could be both protection and threat, capable of driving away troublesome clients or of turning their violence inward at the smallest perceived slight. Aligning with such a figure could make a woman untouchable in certain districts. But it also tied her fate to his, and when he fell out of favor or into prison, she often paid the price. The women learned to read the signs. A man whose drink flowed too freely, whose voice rose too quickly, whose promises came too easily docked in these closed rooms, the balance of power could shift unexpectedly. A wealthy client, relaxed and unguarded, after an evening of drink and company, might confess fears, ambitions, or doubts that he would never admit elsewhere. In such moments, the woman listening held a kind of power herself, the power of knowing, of seeing the man behind the role. Some used this gently, offering comfort without exploitation. Others tucked such knowledge away like a blade in a sheath, to be drawn only if needed. This unspoken exchange of vulnerability for discretion was one of the most valuable currencies in their world. The setting of these encounters varied, each bringing its atmosphere. In the finest rooms, velvet drapes muted the street noise, and the furniture was polished to a deep shine. A decanter of brandy might stand beside a silver dish of sugared fruits, the fire burning steadily in the grate. In more modest establishments, the comfort was less reliable: a single candle for light, a threadbare rug over creaking boards, the air cool enough to see one's breath in winter. Yet in both, the core dynamic remained, a meeting on terms shaped by need, desire, and the unspoken understanding that what passed between them here must not follow them back into the daylight. For the women, the aftermath of such nights could linger. A generous gift might cover a week's rent, a whispered warning might steer them clear of danger, or a new connection might promise better work. But just as often, the traces left were intangible. The feeling of having glimpsed a hidden side of the city's power, of having touched the machinery that moved its fortunes, and of knowing that their role in it would remain unacknowledged. They returned to their regular routines, to the street or the parlor, carrying these fragments of influence like invisible weights. Yet not every encounter ended cleanly. Sometimes a man returned demanding the same intimacy without offering the same payment or claiming a kind of ownership over the woman's time. Others, emboldened by the secrecy of their meetings, pushed boundaries they had once respected. In these moments, the fragile equilibrium broke, and the woman's safety depended on her ability to reassert limits alone, or with the backing of her network. The risk was constant. To yield too much was to invite exploitation. To push back too hard was to risk losing a valuable connection or incurring dangerous wrath. These rooms, with their closed doors and muffled voices, were crucibles where the city's hidden currents met. They revealed the strange intimacy between the underworld and the upper echelons, the way wealth and influence flowed through channels that polite society pretended did not exist. But they were not the only places where such currents moved. Beyond the parlors and private chambers, another world of negotiation and survival thrived in the public entertainments of the age music halls, theaters, pleasure garden spaces, where women could meet clients in plain sight under the cover of song and spectacle. To step into that world is to see yet another face of Victorian London's nocturnal life. The music halls and theatres of Victorian London were bright, noisy worlds in stark contrast to the dim, private rooms of the brothels and lodging houses, yet they formed another essential thread in the tapestry of the city's sex trade. Here, in the glare of footlights and the raucous energy of a crowd, women could mingle with potential clients openly, their presence masked by the chaos of entertainment. Music halls were the meeting ground for every class, costermongers and clerks, rubbing elbows with shop owners, soldiers, and occasionally well-dressed gentlemen from the West End who came slumming for a night of rough fun. The air was thick with the smell of beer, tobacco, and cheap perfume, the floor sticky underfoot from spilled drink, the walls vibrating with laughter, applause, and the pounding rhythms of the piano. Singers belted out bawdy songs with a wink and a grin. Dancers twirled and flashed glimpses of stocking. Comedians traded in innuendo that drew knowing nods from the audience. It was a place where respectability could be set aside for a few hours. And for the women who worked these rooms, whether as barmaids, singers, or simply patrons, it was fertile ground for making connections. Barmaids, in particular, occupied a unique position in this environment. Officially, they served drinks and managed the flow of customers, but unofficially, many also used the role as a way to arrange meetings for later. A smile here, a few extra moments of conversation there, and a quick scribbled address on a scrap of paper could lead to a paid rendezvous once the night's work ended. The job had its advantages. The bar offered some measure of safety, as the women were surrounded by staff and other patrons, and it allowed them to vet potential clients in a public setting before agreeing to anything. But it also carried risks: unwanted attention from drunken customers, pressure from employers to keep the men spending, and the ever-present danger of someone trying to take liberties in the crowded, dimly lit space, not the performers themselves. Especially the more popular singers and dancers often became the subject of gossip and speculation. Some cultivated an air of mystery, hinting at romantic entanglements with wealthy admirers, while never confirming anything outright. Others were more open, meeting with patrons after shows or arranging private parties in nearby rooms. The blurred line between performer and sex worker was both an opportunity and a hazard. Fame could attract better-paying clients, but it could also bring unwanted scrutiny from moral reformers, journalists, or the police. The city's newspapers occasionally printed scandalous accounts of fallen actresses caught in compromising situations, feeding the public's appetite for both titillation and moral condemnation. Pleasure gardens were another venue where public entertainment and private arrangements intertwined. These open-air spaces, lit by strings of lamps and decorated with exotic plants, offered concerts, dancing, and secluded walks among ornamental shrubs and fountains. Couples both respectable and otherwise wandered the paths, the laughter and music from the main pavilion fading into a quieter hum the further they went. For sex workers, these gardens provided opportunities to meet clients in a more romantic, less crowded setting, though they also posed dangers. The relative seclusion could embolden aggressive men, and the presence of patrolling constables meant that anyone recognized as a prostitute risked arrest for soliciting. Some women learned to work in pairs here, one acting as lookout while the other spoke with a potential client, ready to intervene if trouble arose. Theaters, particularly those in the West End, attracted a wealthier clientele and thus offered different prospects. Women who managed to gain entry, whether by purchasing cheap gallery seats or securing an invitation, could mingle in the intervals, scanning the audience for familiar faces or likely patrons. The opulent foyers with their marble floors, gilded mirrors, and crystal chandeliers were as much a stage for social maneuvering as the one where the actors performed. A brief conversation during intermission, a shared glass of champagne in the bar, could lead to an arrangement that was discreet, profitable, and in some cases, long-term. But entry to these spaces often required connections or resources, and competition among the women who worked them was fierce in all these venues. The challenge was the same: to present oneself as approachable without appearing desperate, to be engaging without being indiscreet, to strike the balance between visibility and subtlety. The women who succeeded were those who could read the room as easily as they read a man's face, who could shift their manner to suit the mood of the crowd, and who understood when to press an opportunity and when to let it pass. It was a different skill set from the one required on the street or in the brothel, but no less demanding. The stakes were high. A single promising connection could lead to weeks of steady income, while a single misstep could result in ejection from the venue, loss of reputation, or worse. These public entertainments also served another function. They were places where the women could feel, however briefly, part of the city's broader life. They could laugh at the same jokes as everyone else, cheer for the same songs, and share in the communal thrill of a performance. For a few hours, the boundaries between their world and that of their clients blurred, and they could pass as ordinary patrons rather than marked women. Of course, the illusion ended as soon as the lights went down and the crowd dispersed, but it was still a respite from the constant awareness of their status. Yet beneath the lights and laughter, the dangers were never far away. The noise of the music hall could mask a threat until it was too close to avoid. The dark paths of the pleasure garden could conceal more than romance. And while the public setting offered some safety, it also meant that any confrontation could quickly turn into a spectacle, drawing attention from the very authorities the women sought to avoid. The balance was delicate, and maintaining it required constant vigilance. These venues, with their mingling of classes and their blend of entertainment and opportunity, reveal yet another side of Victorian London's nocturnal economy. They were places where deals were struck in plain sight, where performance and seduction danced together, and where the line between public and private blurred until it almost disappeared. But beyond the music halls, gardens, and theaters lay an even harsher environment, the city's streets in their rawest form. During the hours when the respectable citizens had gone to bed and the predators of the night claimed the darkness for their own. To step into that world is to face the most dangerous hours of a prostitute's life. The late-night streets of Victorian London, after the music halls emptied and the pleasure gardens went dark, were an entirely different world, a harsher, leaner stage where the glow of gas lamps barely held back the deep pools of shadow, and every sound carried a weight of meaning. By 2 a.m, the bustle had thinned to a scattering of figures moving through the fog. Night watchmen on their rounds, cab drivers hunched in their seats, a few drunks weaving their way home, and the women who remained out because they could not afford to go in. The air was colder, carrying the metallic scent of the Thames, mixed with the sour tang of stale beer and refuse. The cobblestones gleamed wet underfoot, slicked from mist or an earlier rain, and the steady drip of water from eaves punctuated the silence like a slow clock. For a woman working these hours, every detail mattered, the number of footsteps behind her, the flicker of movement at the edge of her vision, the way a man's voice carried in the stillness. This was when the predators came out, both those looking for sex and those looking for something to take, and the line between the two could vanish in an instant. The dangers were not always obvious. A man might begin as a friendly companion, offering to walk her home, only to lead her down a darker lane where escape would be harder. Others arrived already spoiling for a fight, their tempers sharpened by drink, quick to take offense at a refusal or an imagined slight. Street robbery was common, and prostitutes were frequent targets, assumed to be carrying cash from their night's work. Some men struck fast and fled. Others used intimidation, grabbing an arm, blocking the path, speaking in low, threatening tones until the woman surrendered her purse. Violence could come without warning, and many women bore scars, both visible and hidden, from encounters that had nothing to do with the trade itself. The police presence in these hours was inconsistent at best. A constable might patrol a busy thoroughfare, swinging his lantern in a slow arc, but in the warren of alleys and back streets, law enforcement was often absent or worse, part of the problem. Some officers took bribes to look the other way. Others saw the late-night streets as an opportunity for harassment or worse, knowing the women had little recourse. A few genuinely tried to keep order, intervening when trouble flared, but they were the exception. The women relied more on each other than on any official protection, using signals to warn of danger. A certain whistle, the calling of a common name that meant stay away, or even the sudden closing of a shawl around the shoulders as a sign to avoid a nearby man. Competition for clients in these late hours was fierce. Those still on the street were often desperate for one last transaction before the night ended, and tempers could flare between women working the same patch. Arguments could start over something as small as who stood closer to the corner or who first approached a passing man. Yet just as often, solidarity prevailed a shared cigarette, a quick lookout while a friend negotiated, a warm drink bought from an all-night coffee stall and passed from hand to hand. Survival in these hours required both quick judgment and the ability to adapt to shifting alliances. The clients themselves were a mixed and unpredictable lot. Some were working men who had been drinking since the end of their shift, looking for company before heading home. Others were wealthier men returning from the clubs, their inhibitions loosened by expensive spirits, drawn by the thrill of slumming in neighborhoods they would avoid in daylight. There were also men with nowhere to go, seeking comfort or warmth, for an hour in exchange for whatever coins they had left. The transactions at this hour were often shorter, more hurried, the surroundings rougher, an alleyway, a stairwell, a sheltered doorway. The risk of interruption was high, and the payment sometimes barely worth the danger. Yet for many women, even a small sum could mean the difference between a meal in the morning or going hungry. The physical toll of these hours was immense. Standing or walking for hours on damp stone left feet swollen and sore, skirts and petticoats heavy with moisture. The cold seeped into bones and muscles, stiffening fingers that still had to adjust clothing, exchange coins, or hold a lamp. Fatigue dulled reflexes, making it harder to spot danger in time. And yet, there was also a certain resilience in those who made it through night after night, a toughness forged by necessity, by the repeated act of stepping back onto the cobblestones, no matter what the previous evening had brought. The street, at this hour, was also a place of strange, fleeting beauty. Fog curled around the lamps, turning their light into soft halos. The sound of distant horses' hooves echoed like a heartbeat through the sleeping city. Sometimes, in the rare stillness between encounters, a woman might pause to look at the river glinting faintly under the moon, the water carrying reflections of buildings that seemed softer, almost gentle, in the night air. These moments were not enough to erase the danger, but they were a reminder that even in the harshest hours, the city held corners of quiet that belonged to those who stayed awake to see them. For the women, these hours demanded constant calculation. How long to stay out, which streets to avoid, which faces to trust. The decision to call it a night was never simple. Leaving too early meant lost income. Staying too late increased the risk of violence or arrest. Some returned to lodging houses before dawn, slipping into narrow beds, while the first market carts rattled toward Covent Garden. Others waited until the first light began to filter through the fog, the city stirring back to life before seeking rest. This was the raw edge of their world, stripped of the glamour that sometimes cloaked it in the music halls or the better brothels. Here, survival was the only constant, and the night was both a livelihood and a gauntlet. Yet even in this stark setting, stories unfolded moments of bravery, of kindness, of sharp wit turning aside danger. And as we follow these women back from the cold, wet stones of the night into the relative warmth of the spaces they called home, we come to another crucial part of their lives, the places where they tried to rest, recover, and prepare for the next night's work. The rooms where these women rested, if rest was the right word, were a world apart from the places where they worked. Yet they carried the same mixture of impermanence, necessity, and quiet endurance. For some, the end of a night's work meant returning to a shared lodging house, the kind that stood on narrow, damp streets where the windows rattled in their frames whenever a cart passed. The front door, heavy and scuffed, might be locked. After midnight, requiring a knock or a familiar code to gain entry. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled scents of damp clothes, unwashed floors, coal smoke, and the faint traces of gin or cheap tea. Light came from a few smoky lamps, casting shadows across the walls and floorboards, worn to a shine like countless feet. Women came and went quietly at all hours, their movements soft, their faces set in expressions that revealed little of the night they just endured. The beds were narrow and often shared. In the cheapest lodgings, 2 women might sleep head to toe to save money, their meager belongings tucked into a bag or under a pillow for safety. Bedding was rarely clean. Damp blankets held the musty smell of countless nights and countless tenants. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Conversations drifted through thin walls and worn curtains, sometimes murmurs of friendship, whispered arguments over money or territory, the restless movements of those who could not find sleep. In such cramped quarters, every sound was amplified. The creak of a floorboard, the cough of someone fighting illness, the muffled sob of a woman turning her face to the wall. For those slightly better off, a rented room above a shop or tavern offered more space and control. These rooms might have a single bed, a washstand, a small mirror, and perhaps a chair. They were still spare, but they allowed a woman to keep her hours, to return without the scrutiny of a landlady, and to decide who entered her space. Even here, however, the sense of security was fragile. Rent was due weekly, sometimes daily, and a slow stretch of work could mean eviction with little notice. Some women furnished their rooms with small comforts, flowers in a chipped vase, a blanket in a brighter color, a shelf of books bought second-hand. These touches were less about luxury than about claiming some part of life as their own, marking a space as more than just a place to collapse after work. That the act of coming home was often ritualized. In the lodging houses, it began with a few words exchanged with whoever sat by the fire or the stove, a brief check-in to confirm who had made it back. In the private rooms, it meant locking the door behind oneself, leaning against it for a moment, to breathe in the quiet, shaking off the cold and the strain of the night. Clothes were removed carefully, hung to dry if damp from mist or rain. In the worst weather, stockings were spread near the small grate, the faint smell of wet wool filling the room. If there was a kettle, it was set to boil, the warmth of tea, easing the ache in hands and feet. Illness was a constant shadow in these resting places. The close quarters of lodging houses made the spread of coughs, fevers, and more serious diseases almost inevitable. Women who worked while sick often returned. Weaker, their earnings barely enough to pay for medicine or the simplest food. Remedies were shared old recipes passed down from mothers or grandmothers, herbs bought from street vendors, and small doses of laudanum to quiet pain and induce sleep. The better off could sometimes afford a doctor, though many avoided them, fearing the judgment and questions that might follow. Rest was the truest medicine they could hope for, yet even that was interrupted by the knowledge that the next night's work was already approaching dot in these spaces. The bonds between women could be strongest. A newcomer might be offered a blanket, a share of bread, or advice on the safest routes home. Someone who had suffered violence might find her injuries tended by a friend, her story met with nods of grim understanding rather than shock, or moments of laughter, two stories of foolish clients, of near misses with the law, of absurdities in the night's work that seemed funnier when told in the safety of a shared room. These moments of camaraderie did not erase the hardships, but they made them bearable, stitching together a sense of belonging in a life where so much else was transient. Yet even in these places of supposed rest, the work was never entirely set. Aside, a knock on the door could mean a client seeking company after hours, a friend delivering news, or a warning that the police were making rounds. The rooms themselves could be watched by those who wished to control or exploit the women. A brothel madam, a pimp, or even a landlady might demand extra payments or favors to protect the occupant's privacy. The line between personal space and workspace was never clean, and the women lived with the awareness that rest was temporary, conditional, and often interrupted. For some, the return home was the loneliest part of the night. In the quiet without, the noise of the street or the distraction of conversation, the weight of exhaustion and the memories of unpleasant encounters could press in. A few found solace in small rituals, writing letters, mending clothes, reading until sleep came. Others turned to drink or laudanum to push away thoughts long enough to rest. And always, the knowledge lingered that in just a few hours, they would need to prepare again, stepping back into the streets or the parlors, repeating the cycle that sustained them and trapped them in equal measure. These rooms, humble or shabby as they were, formed the anchor points of their lives, the places to which they returned with their earnings, their bruises, their stories. They were not havens in the truest sense, but they were the closest thing to home many of these women knew, and within them, plans were made not just for the next night, but for futures that might take them away from the life they lived, if they could only gather enough resources, courage, or luck. Some dreamed of marriage, others of opening small businesses, others of disappearing entirely into a new city where no one knew their name. Whether these dreams were realized or not, they were kept alive in the quiet hours between work and sleep. For all the importance of these resting places, they were just one part of a larger survival system, one that extended into the daylight hours, when the women were not working, but still navigating the world as marked figures in Victorian society. How they spent their days, how they were seen and treated when the sun was up, revealed as much about their place in the city as anything that happened under the cover of night. Daylight in Victorian London had a way of exposing things the night could soften or conceal. The fog was thinner, the streets louder, the faces clearer, and for women who worked the city's nights, the sun could be both a relief and a risk. In the mornings, the markets bustled, barrows piled with vegetables and flowers rolled over. Cobbles still slicked from night rains. Hawkers shouted prices, and the air was a jumbled mix of coal smoke, baking bread, and horse manure. The city's rhythm quickened, and into this busy tide the women moved, no longer hidden by darkness, their presence impossible to disguise. Some wore the same dresses from the night before, now slightly disheveled, skirts bearing faint stains from muddy streets. Others changed into plainer attire to pass, as best they could, for seamstresses, laundresses, or shop girls on errands. Yet the trained eyes of neighbors and passers-by could often tell. A certain way of walking, the tiredness in the face, the hours kept it, marked them in ways that were hard to shake, and in daylight, there was no anonymity in being recognized. The reception they met varied by neighborhood. In poorer districts, where many lived one step from destitution, their presence was tolerated as another facet of survival. Shopkeepers might sell to them without comment. Children might follow them with giggles or mimicry, and older women might nod in a kind of resigned acknowledgement. In more respectable areas, however, they risked verbal abuse, stares, and even physical shoving from those who saw them as a threat to public morals. Some moral reformers, emboldened by the daylight and the sense of being on God's work, would approach with tracts, urging repentance, offering places in institutions that promised shelter and honest work, but often at the cost of freedom and autonomy. For the women, these encounters were wearyingly familiar. They knew the offers rarely came without strings, and that the rescue could be as confining and punitive as the life they already led. Afternoons could be used for rest, but for many, they were a time to manage the practicalities of living. Rent had to be paid, food bought, and clothing mended or replaced. Pawnbroker shops were busy, women bringing in small possessions, a shawl, a pair of boots, a piece of jewelry from a client's gift, to trade for enough coins to carry them to the next paying night. Some made visits to sympathetic seamstresses or laundresses who could repair or refresh the garments needed for work. Those with children, often boarded out to relatives or in charitable homes, might use the daylight to visit, bringing small treats or coins. These visits were bittersweet, short-lived reunions that ended with the same painful separation, the child too young to fully understand why the mother could not stay. For others, the day brought a chance to conduct business of a different sort. A discreet meeting in a cafe or tea shop with a regular client might yield extra income without the risks of the street. Such meetings were conducted carefully, choosing places where they would not be recognized, keeping conversation light enough to pass for ordinary, yet leaving space for the negotiations that kept the arrangement alive. In these moments, the line between the woman's public and private self blurred once again, as she navigated the expectations of a man who might see her differently in daylight than he did in the secrecy of night. The physical toll of their work was more visible during the day. In the harsh light, the pallor of fatigue showed plainly. The eyes, rimmed red from too little sleep, the hands chapped from cold nights gripping shawls or door frames. Some bore fading bruises or scratches from rough encounters, hidden at night by clothing or shadow, but harder to disguise in daylight. Illnesses could no longer be ignored. The cough that worsened with each week, the stiffness in the joints, the rashes from damp clothing and poor hygiene. Public health measures rarely reached them with compassion. Doctors were costly and charitable. Clinics were often judgmental, offering treatment only alongside lectures on morality. Yet for all this, daylight also offered small reprieves. The warmth of the sun on a cold day, the smell of fresh bread from a bakery, the rare kindness of a shopkeeper who slipped an extra roll into the bag. These moments could feel like a thin thread tying them to the wider human experience. A few women maintained friendships outside the trade, carefully cultivated with neighbors, cousins, or old-school acquaintances. These relationships had to be handled delicately. Too much truth could invite gossip. Too much secrecy could erode trust. Still, they were valuable, offering a reminder that they were more than their work in the eyes of at least a few in the city's parks. Some women sought quiet, sitting on a bench with a book, feeding pigeons, or simply watching the world go by. They could be part of the crowd without being its focus. In these spaces, there was room to breathe, to imagine a life not dictated by the cycle of night and coin. Dreams surfaced in these moments: a small dressmaking shop, a move to the countryside, a steady home with someone who cared. Whether realistic or not, they offered a mental escape, a place in the mind where survival was not the only goal. But daylight also brought exposure to the law in another form. Under various vagrancy and public order statutes, a woman identified as a prostitute could be arrested even when not soliciting, simply for being in a place deemed improper. Constables, spotting familiar faces, could decide to move them along, fine them, or drag them into court. These arrests, especially during the day, carried a heavier social penalty. Neighbors saw, employers of friends and family saw, and the humiliation was harder to shake. A court appearance could result in a fine that wiped out a week's earnings. Or worse, time in prison, which could mean losing one's lodgings and possessions entirely. Navigating the day required as much calculation as surviving the night. It was a different kind of visibility, no less dangerous, but more subtle, bound up in the judgment of the public and the quiet enforcement of laws designed to keep them on the margins. And as the afternoon light began to fade, the city shifted. Again, shops closed, lamps were lit, and the streets took on that familiar mix of promise and peril. For these women, the day was never truly separate from the night. It was simply the interval in which they prepared, healed, and decided how to face what the next darkness would bring. And with the return of that darkness came another set of challenges, for not all nights were equal. There were certain occasions, events, and seasons that reshaped the rhythm of their work entirely. Not every night in Victorian London followed the same rhythm. Certain events, seasons, and occasions altered the city's pulse, and with it, the fortunes of the women who worked its streets, parlors, and private rooms. Public holidays, like Christmas and Easter, brought their peculiar shifts. In the days leading up to them, trade could be brisk men spending more freely before returning to family obligations, workers flush with holiday wages, sailors newly ashore looking for company before ships departed again. On the nights of the holidays themselves, the streets could be oddly empty or unusually dangerous, depending on the district. Some neighborhoods became quiet, their residents gathered indoors. Others filled with drunken revelers, their cheer tipping easily into aggression. For the women, these were nights of calculation. To venture out meant the chance of earning well from those in high spirits, but also the heightened risk of trouble from men, emboldened by drink and anonymity. Seasonal events brought their patterns. In winter, the cold bit deep, slowing the pace of street work, as fewer clients lingered outdoors, and the women themselves were driven to find sheltered corners, doorways, or indoor venues. Breath steamed in the air, fingers stiffened, and the heavy skirts grew heavier, still with damp from snow or rain. Work in these months often shifted toward the brothels and music halls, where warmth could be found, though at the cost of a share, to the madam or manager. In summer, by contrast, the longer evenings and warmer air drew more people into public spaces, extending the hours in which encounters could be made. Pleasure gardens, open-air concerts, and crowded riverside walks became fertile ground for business, though the openness also meant greater visibility to police and moral reformers. Royal events, political rallies, and public spectacles could transform the city overnight. A royal procession might draw thousands to the streets, including wealthy visitors from the countryside or abroad, their pockets full and their eyes eager for diversion once the day's formalities were done. Political gatherings brought crowds of men to the city, some of whom sought out company in the evenings, their conversations about policy giving way to more personal pursuits. Even criminal trials of public fascination like those involving notorious murders drew onlookers from near and far, and the city's nightlife swelled in their wake. The women learned to read the calendar as closely as any tradesman, anticipating when and where the crowds would be thickest, adjusting their routes and appearances accordingly. Sundays were peculiar. Respectable society devoted them to church and rest, but for those outside the bounds of that respectability, Sunday could be one of the busiest nights of the week. Men who had spent the day in pious company often sought release afterward, and the tension between the sermon and the street made for a strange, charged atmosphere. In some districts, the police were stricter on Sundays, enforcing laws against public disorder more aggressively. In others, they turned a blind eye, especially if paid to do so. For the women, Sunday night required the same wariness as any other, but with an added awareness that hypocrisy and indulgence often walked hand in hand. That season also shaped appearance and strategy. In winter, shawls and cloaks concealed much, both the body from the cold and the face from recognition. The dim pools of lamplight meant a smile or gesture had to be more deliberate to catch a client's eye. In summer, lighter dresses and brighter. Colors could attract attention from a greater distance, and the warmth allowed for longer, more leisurely negotiations in the open air. Yet summer also brought its hazards. The streets were more crowded, the competition more visible, and the police more likely to patrol popular spots. The shifting balance of these factors was a constant mental calculation, a silent ledger each woman kept as she moved through the city. Special events in the districts themselves shaped opportunities too. The opening of a new tavern, a fairground, setting up for a week, a theater premiere each was a chance to work a new crowd. Some women made it their business to know the city's entertainment calendar as well as any theater manager, traveling between districts to catch the busiest nights. This mobility came with risk. Stepping into another woman's territory could spark conflict, but the potential rewards often outweighed the dangers. The most skilled navigators of the trade could double or triple their earnings by anticipating where the demand would be strongest. Yet these busy nights also magnified the risks. Crowds meant anonymity, and anonymity could shield a predator as easily as it did a worker. The noise and press of bodies could make it harder to spot trouble until it was too late. Pickpockets targeted the women as much as their clients, knowing they often carried cash. Police raids were more likely during high-profile events, as authorities sought to clean up the streets for visiting dignitaries or to appease public sensibilities. Being caught in such a sweep could mean hours in a cold cell, a fine that wiped out the night's earnings, or worse, the loss of a regular place to work if the arrest drew too much attention. Through it all, the women adapted. They altered their routes, their clothing, their manner of approach. They learned which events drew generous patrons and which drew troublemakers, which nights to push their luck and which to stay in. Survival in their world was not only about enduring the dangers of an ordinary night, but also about reading the city's shifting moods, its special occasions, and its seasonal turns, and bending those rhythms to their advantage. But while these external changes shaped their work, there were internal forces too: personal histories, emotional bonds, and private ambitions that influenced every choice they made. The next turn in our journey brings us closer to these inner lives, to the stories they told each other in the quiet hours, and to the memories and hopes they carried like hidden treasures beneath the layers of their public selves. In the hours between the last client's departure and the first gray light of dawn, a different world unfolded within the rooms and behind the curtains of Victorian London's sex trade, world unseen by those who only thought of its streets as places of transaction. It was in these hushed hours that the women let down their hair, loosened the stays of their corsets, and allowed their public faces to fade. Here, among one another, they spoke with a frankness that the outside world could not imagine. Some talked about the night's encounters with a mixture of amusement and disbelief, telling stories that made the others laugh until their sides ached. Others spoke in quieter tones, sharing the details of a man who frightened them, or the tricks they used to avoid his temper without losing his payment. There was a language here that was not written in any dictionary, a shorthand of glances, touches, and half-sentences that carried entire histories. The camaraderie among these women was not the naive sisterhood that moral reformers sometimes romanticized in their pamphlets. It was a bond forged in necessity, tempered by competition, and laced with the knowledge that survival in their world could not always be shared equally. They lent each other hairpins, stockings, or the last bit of rouge, but they also knew that a promising client could make a friend into a rival in the space of a moment. Still, there were rules spoken and unspoken that governed their interactions. One did not steal a regular client from another without permission. One did not betray the hiding place of a fellow worker's earnings to a pimp or a violent lover. One did not leave a woman alone with a man known to be dangerous. Those who broke these codes often found themselves ostracized, their work made harder not by the police, but by the deliberate coldness of their peers. Among themselves, they spoke of dreams that went beyond the next night's work. One might save for a small shop, another for a ticket to America, another simply for enough to leave the trade and live quietly in a place where no one knew her past. They spoke of children left with relatives in the countryside, of lovers lost to illness or drink, of husbands who had abandoned them or died in the mines or on the sea. Some of these stories were true. Others were reshaped in the telling, becoming a way to test the boundaries of trust in the room. Lies could be as protective as locks on a door, and in their world, every woman had learned that the truth was a commodity not to be given lightly. Even in these private spaces, danger could find its way in. A drunk client pounding at the door, a police raid on suspicion of gambling or illegal drinking, a violent man tracking a woman he considered his property. Any of these could shatter the fragile sense of safety. The women became adept at reading the sound of footsteps on the stairs, the tone of a man's voice through a door, the creak of floorboards in the hallway. They could tell from the way a handle turned whether it was a friend returning with a loaf of bread or a threat they would need to face together. These instincts became second nature, as essential to their survival as knowing which streets to avoid at certain hours. The private hours were also moments of care. They tended to one another's injuries, bruises from rough clients, cuts from broken glass, burns from candle wax or cigars. They shared remedies for coughs, recipes for hearty stews that stretched, small coins into several meals, and the names of doctors or midwives who could be trusted not to judge. In a society that denied them entry to most forms of respectable charity, they became each other's first and often only line of support. It was an unacknowledged form of health care, born of necessity and passed from woman to woman like secret knowledge. Yet for all the solidarity, some divides could not be bridged. Age, appearance, and reputation created invisible hierarchies. The younger, more fashionable women often had better chances at wealthier clients, while the older ones relied on experience, regulars, or work in more discreet venues. There was a harsh economy to beauty in their world, one that could rise or fall in a single season, depending on health, fashion, or scandal. A sudden illness could strip away not only a woman's earnings, but her place in the unspoken ranking of desirability. And once a woman slipped too far down that invisible ladder, the climb back up was almost impossible. Still, the nights always came again, and with them, the rituals of preparation. Dresses mended, hair styled, faces painted. Stories rehearsed for clients who wanted conversation as much as or more than anything physical. Some women cultivated a particular identity, a role to play for the men who paid for their time. One might be the innocent country girl, another the worldly widow, another the exotic foreigner. These identities could be worn and shed like costumes. But over time, the line between the performance and the self could blur. Some women found comfort in these personas. Others felt trapped by them, yet both knew they were part of the trade's currency. And so the hours between darkness and dawn were not merely a pause in the work, but an essential part of it, a time to heal, to plan, to guard, and to remember who they were when no one was buying. In those fragile moments, they stitched together lives from scraps of safety and bursts of laughter, building something that might not survive the morning, but mattered fiercely in the night. Yet the morning always came, and with it, the necessity of returning to the streets or rooms where their public selves lived. And as we follow them back into the city's daylight, we begin to see how the Victorian world regarded them, not as complex individuals, but as symbols in a moral debate that would shape laws, policies, and the very streets they walked. By the mid-19th century, the Victorian debate over prostitution had reached a fever pitch. dividing society into camps that were equally certain of their moral rightness, yet rarely willing to listen to one another. Politicians, clergymen, reformers, physicians, and self-styled moral guardians filled the newspapers and public halls with their pronouncements. To the respectable classes, prostitutes were often spoken of as both a social disease and a necessary evil, an unfortunate underclass whose existence must be acknowledged but whose presence must be controlled. This contradiction, treating them as both indispensable and intolerable, shaped nearly every law, every raid, and every sermon directed at them. In Parliament, discussions of the so-called great social evil often veered between calls for harsher punishments and proposals for regulated tolerance, as though a balance could be struck between morality and pragmatism. Medical voices, emboldened by new understandings of disease, pushed for inspections and registration systems that would, in theory, protect soldiers, sailors, and the general public from the spread of venereal disease. But behind the language of public health lay an unspoken reality. These measures were less about protecting the women themselves and more about preserving the health of the men who paid for their services. It was out of this climate that the Contagious Diseases Acts were born, beginning in the 1860s. Under these laws, certain garrison towns and port cities became zones where the police could forcibly detain women suspected of being prostitutes, subject them to medical examinations, and confine them to hospitals if they were found to have venereal disease. No formal charge was needed. Suspicion alone was enough. The examinations themselves were invasive and humiliating, conducted with instruments that left many women physically and emotionally scarred. Once registered under the Acts, a woman found it nearly impossible to return to any semblance of anonymity. Her name was kept on record, her movements monitored, her body repeatedly subjected to state control. To many reformers, these laws were an outrage illegal, sanctioning of sexual double standards in which women bore the entirety of the burden for a problem that involved men just as much. To others, particularly those in the military or maritime communities, the Acts were a regrettable but necessary safeguard for public order and national strength. But outside the halls of government, the women themselves lived with the consequences. A woman working in one of these regulated towns might find herself stopped in the street, ordered to report for examination, and unable to refuse without risking imprisonment. If she failed to attend, the police could come for her at any hour. Some women tried to avoid the Acts by moving frequently, taking work in unregulated areas, or changing their names. Others attempted to bribe or charm their way past the attentions of the local authorities. There were even instances of women cutting their hair, dressing as men, or marrying in haste to escape the reach of the law. But such measures were temporary. At best, the shadow of suspicion could return at any moment, undoing whatever fragile stability they had managed to build. The Acts also had the effect of reshaping the geography of prostitution in England. In regulated towns, the trade often moved indoors, into lodging houses, discreet parlors, or hidden rooms above taverns. In unregulated areas, street walking remained more visible, sometimes growing even more chaotic as women displaced from regulated zones sought new territories. This migration created friction between local populations and newcomers, sometimes sparking turf disputes that were settled not by the police, but by the women themselves, through a mix of negotiation, intimidation, and, on occasion, outright violence. The competition was especially fierce in cities like London, where entire neighborhoods became known for their concentrations of sex work, each with its own character, clientele, and unwritten rules. The legal measures also prompted a counter-movement and organized resistance led by women who refused to be silent. Foremost among them was Josephine Butler, a fierce, articulate campaigner who traveled the country giving lectures, writing pamphlets, and confronting politicians. She spoke not only against the acts themselves, but against the broader hypocrisy of a society that punished women for sins it excused in men. To her, the laws were a form of state-sponsored violence, degrading to the women they claimed to protect and corrosive to the moral integrity of the nation. Butler's campaigns were met with jeers, heckling, and sometimes physical danger. But she and her allies persisted, gathering signatures, organizing petitions, and forcing debates in Parliament. Over time, their relentless efforts began to erode public support for the acts, revealing cracks in the consensus that had once seemed unshakable. For the women still working under the shadow of these laws, the repeal movement offered a glimmer of hope, but change came slowly. In the meantime, they continued to navigate the same dangerous terrain as before: clients who might become violent, landlords who exploited their dependents, and a public that alternately ignored and despised them. The stigma was so deep that even those who managed to leave the trade often found the world outside unwilling to let them forget their past. A former prostitute might find work as a seamstress, a laundress, or a domestic servant, only to be dismissed if her history came to light. Marriage could offer a way out, but the number of men willing to marry a woman with such a past was small, and those who did often wield the knowledge of her history as a form of control. The Victorian obsession with classifying, labeling, and containing these women extended even into charitable work. Rescue homes, often run by religious organizations, offered shelter and training for fallen women. But their rules were strict, their moral demands unyielding. Residents were required to renounce their past lives entirely, embrace religious instruction, and submit to a rigid schedule of prayer, labor, and obedience. For some, these homes provided a genuine opportunity to start anew. For others, they were simply another form of confinement, little different in spirit from the regulations of the Contagious Diseases Acts. Many women cycled in and out of such institutions, unable or unwilling to conform to their requirements, returning to the streets when the restrictions became unbearable dot in the public imagination. Prostitutes remained a paradox, both feared and pitied, condemned and commodified. They appeared in the literature of the age as tragic heroines, comic foils, or symbols of urban corruption. Painters and photographers sought to capture them as either pitiable wretches or alluring temptresses, rarely acknowledging the reality that most lived somewhere in between. These depictions fed back into the debates over their place in society, reinforcing stereotypes that made genuine understanding even harder to achieve. The real women, the ones who lived, worked, laughed, suffered, and adapted in the shadows, remained largely invisible to the respectable classes whose opinions shaped the laws. By the time the Contagious Diseases Acts were finally repealed in the 1880s, the women who had borne the brunt of their enforcement had already endured decades of stigma and control. The repeal was a victory for Butler and her allies, but it did not erase the social attitudes that had justified the acts in the first place. The law no longer claimed the right to forcibly examine a woman's body, but the unwritten laws of society still dictated her worth, her options, and her safety. The streets would remain dangerous, the police unpredictable, and the opportunities for reinvention scarce. And so, while one form of oppression had been dismantled, the deeper structures that sustained it remained in place. The repeal also ushered in a period of uncertainty. Without the acts, authorities experimented with new ways of managing prostitution, stepped up policing of known brothels, moral crusades to clean up certain neighborhoods, and renewed pressure on landlords to evict women suspected of selling sex. This shifting landscape created both risks and opportunities for the women themselves. Some saw a chance to work more freely, while others found the increased police attention more suffocating than the old system. The constant flux meant that adaptability was as valuable as beauty or charm. Those who could read the changing mood of a neighborhood, anticipate a crackdown, or reinvent their working arrangements often fared better than those who clung to old patterns. Yet beneath all this legal and social upheaval, the daily rhythm of the trade persisted. Men still came to the same streets, the same rooms, the same women, driven by needs and desires that no law could legislate away. The women still dressed, prepared, and presented themselves in ways calculated to attract and disarm, to fulfill the fantasies their clients brought with them. And in the private hours after the work was done, they still gathered to talk, to laugh, to warn one another, and to plan for futures that might never come. The machinery of the Victorian moral order might creak and shift, but the lived reality of the women at its center remained both stubbornly constant and endlessly changing. And as the century drew toward its close, another force began to reshape their world, one that would come not from Parliament or the pulpit, but from the shadows of the city itself, the rise of organized crime and the shifting economics of vice. That new, more dangerous chapter is where we will turn next. The final decades of the Victorian era brought with them a new kind of danger for women working in the sex trade, one that was less about moral reformers in Parliament and more about the quiet, creeping expansion of organized criminal networks. That saw in prostitution not a moral failing to be corrected, but a lucrative business to be exploited. As the great industrial cities swelled with new arrivals from the countryside and from across the empire, the underworld adapted quickly, building intricate systems of control over the most vulnerable populations. Brothel owners, who had once operated as independent madams, managing their small operations and negotiating with local constables, increasingly found themselves pressured or outright forced to pay protection money to criminal gangs. These gangs were not crude mobs with blunt threats. They were organized, calculating, and embedded deeply into the social fabric of certain neighborhoods. They provided muscle when needed, intimidation when useful, and connections to corrupt. Officials who could make inconvenient raids disappear for a fee. For the women, this meant that the autonomy some had managed to carve out for themselves in earlier years was shrinking. Those who refused to fall under the protection of such groups risked being driven off the streets entirely, their rooms vandalized, or their clients threatened until business dried up. These criminal networks also began to influence the geography and style of prostitution. Some neighborhoods became effectively closed markets where outsiders could not work without permission. Entire blocks were informally owned by gangs, with every lodging house, gin shop, and music hall paying into the same web of bribes and kickbacks. Women working in these zones might find themselves relocated to specific rooms or paired with certain clients according to the gang's arrangement, their earnings carefully monitored. A portion of each night's takings went straight into the gang's pockets, often collected by men whose politeness could vanish in an instant if payment was delayed. This control extended beyond money. Gangs could dictate who a woman could see, what prices she charged, and even how she dressed, shaping the image of the trade to suit their market. For some women, this arrangement provided a perverse kind of security. Gang-protected streets were often safer from random violence by drunken strangers, as any harm to the women was bad for business. But safety came at the price of freedom, and stepping out of line could bring swift, brutal consequences. At the same time, the economics of vice were shifting. The late 19th century saw the growth of entertainment, venues that blurred the line between legitimate leisure and the sex trade. Music halls, dance clubs, and certain theaters became known gathering points for women who sold sex, places where clients could be met under the cover of respectable amusement. Here, a woman might pose as a simple companion, accepting drinks, laughter, and flirtation in public before quietly arranging a more private meeting elsewhere. These venues offered a degree of anonymity that street work could not. But they also came with their hierarchies and gatekeepers owners, who demanded a share of the profits, or who controlled access to the most lucrative clientele. Criminal. Gangs were quick to extend their reach into these spaces, sometimes owning them outright, sometimes simply ensuring that they remained within the profitable network of the underworld. For the women themselves, this meant constant negotiation, not just with clients, but with layers of authority above them. A day's earnings had to be balanced against the demands of landlords, brothel keepers, and gang collectors, each of whom claimed their slice. Some women found ways to manipulate the system to their advantage, playing one faction against another, leveraging personal relationships, or using the protection of one group to shield themselves from the threats of another. Others, less fortunate or less politically skilled, found themselves trapped in cycles of debt and dependency, unable to break free without risking their safety. In such an environment, alliances could be as fleeting as a single night's arrangement, and trust was a rare commodity. Yet not all control came from the shadows. The late Victorian police, increasingly influenced by the rise of professional detective work, began to develop more sophisticated methods for monitoring and managing the sex trade. Undercover officers were deployed into suspected brothels and music halls, sometimes posing as clients, other times as potential employees. Surveillance became more systematic, with notes kept on known addresses, habitual offenders, and patterns of movement across the city. These records, while officially intended to curb crime, also had the effect of mapping out the trade in unprecedented detail information that could be, and often was, sold or leaked to criminal interests who found it useful. For the women, this meant that the walls seemed to be closing in from both sides, the law on one, the underworld on the other, each with its demands and dangers. This dual pressure reshaped the strategies of survival. Women learned to diversify their work, taking in laundry or sewing between clients, or forming discreet partnerships with shopkeepers who would allow them to store personal belongings or money away from the grasp of landlords and gang enforcers. Some formed close-knit circles with other women, pooling resources, sharing intelligence about dangerous clients, and offering mutual protection when moving between neighborhoods. Others placed their trust in individual men, sometimes a lover, sometimes a self-styled protector, whose role was as much about securing a woman's place in the market as it was about offering emotional connection. But these relationships were double-edged. A protector could as easily become an exploiter, and many women found that the price of loyalty was paid in the coin of personal freedom. Even the language of the trade began to reflect these shifts. Slang terms for certain streets, for different types of clients, and the layers of criminal authority filtered into the everyday speech of the women, creating a coded vocabulary that outsiders might hear without understanding. This shared language was both a badge of belonging and a survival tool, allowing information to be passed quickly and discreetly in public. A single phrase could warn a woman that a police raid was imminent, that a client had refused to pay, or that a rival gang was moving in on a profitable area. In a world where confrontation could be fatal, the ability to speak without being heard became as important as the ability to attract a paying customer. The respectable world, for its part, continued to talk about prostitution as if it existed. In some separate, contained sphere, an underworld sealed off from decent society. In reality, the boundaries were far more porous. Men of every class visited brothels or kept mistresses, their money passing through the same hands that also paid off police and funded criminal enterprises. Respectable landlords rented property to known madams. Respectable shopkeepers extended credit to women whose source of income was no secret. And respectable politicians turned a blind eye to the connections between gang leaders and local election campaigns. The sex trade was not an isolated vice. It was a thread woven into the broader economic and political fabric of Victorian life. This uncomfortable truth occasionally burst into public view through scandals that the press seized upon. With glee, a police inspector discovered to be taking bribes from a brothel, a prominent businessman caught in a raid, a clergyman entangled in a rescue mission. That was more exploitative than charitable. These stories were catnip to a readership that publicly condemned vice, but privately consumed every sordid detail. For the women involved, such scandals were rarely liberating. Their names and faces might be splashed across the newspapers, but the attention brought no relief from poverty or stigma. If anything, notoriety made them even more vulnerable, closing off any remaining avenues for leaving the trade dot by the dawn of the 20th century. The Victorian system of managing prostitution through moral reform, legal regulation, and informal criminal control had created a complex, interlocking web from which escape was difficult. Yet within that web, the women themselves continued to find moments of agency, of joy, of defiance. They laughed in the back rooms of pubs, danced in music halls, whispered warnings in alleyways, and sometimes, in rare and fleeting moments, managed to negotiate terms that favored their survival over the demands of the men above them. It was, in these acts, large and small, that the humanity of the trade persisted, refusing to be entirely swallowed by the machinery of exploitation. But the new century would bring with it forces that neither Parliament, nor the police, nor the gangs could control: global upheavals, shifting sexual mores, and a public appetite for reform that would reshape the landscape once again. And in that next chapter, the women of the Victorian underworld would find themselves caught in a storm that blurred the line between liberation and yet another form of control. The turn of the century did not arrive with sudden liberation for the women whose livelihoods and identities were tied to the sex trade. Instead, it brought new forms of scrutiny dressed in the language of progress. Social purity movements, invigorated by shifting moral rhetoric and emboldened by a growing network of activist organizations, began to wield unprecedented influence over legislation. These movements framed their work not merely as the salvation of fallen women, but as a moral cleansing of the nation itself, a vision in which prostitution was not a social reality to be managed, but a stain to be scrubbed out entirely. In public meetings and newspaper editorials, their leaders spoke in absolutes. No woman would choose such a life if she were not forced into it. No society could claim moral health while tolerating the commerce of sex. Yet behind the moral fervor lay the same complexities that had always defined the trade. Women worked for survival, for opportunity, for fleeting moments of autonomy, and sometimes, though few would admit it publicly, for the pleasures of control over men who otherwise held every advantage in daily life. The reformers, however, saw only victims or criminals, and their campaigns increasingly pushed for harsher policing and tighter regulation, believing that coercion could accomplish what charity had failed to do. One of the most influential developments of this period was the intensification of the so-called white slave panic, a moral crisis fueled by lurid tales of young English girls being kidnapped and sold into continental brothels, or foreign women being smuggled into Britain for the same purpose. Newspapers carried breathless accounts of shadowy traffickers prowling railway stations, snatching innocent maidens under the noses of their families, spiriting them away to a life of degradation in foreign lands. While there were genuine cases of exploitation and trafficking, much of the public narrative was exaggerated, stoking xenophobia as much as it inspired protective zeal. Foreign-born women working in the English sex trade found themselves particularly targeted, depicted not as victims in need of rescue, but as corrupting influences whose very presence threatened the purity of British womanhood. This hysteria provided reformers with powerful ammunition. Laws could now be proposed not simply in the name of morality, but in the name of national security, of defending the homeland from invasive vice. The public appetite for such narratives created strange alliances. Religious reformers, women's suffrage activists, temperance campaigners, and even certain factions within the police force found common cause in pushing for measures like the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1912, which raised the age of consent and strengthened penalties for procuring or trafficking women. On paper, these changes promised protection. In practice, they gave the police broader powers to detain and interrogate women suspected of prostitution, often on little more than hearsay. Raids became more frequent, particularly in working-class neighborhoods already under constant surveillance. Women could be taken in for questioning simply for being found in the wrong company, at the wrong hour, in the wrong part of town. The moral language of the day cloaked these intrusions in respectability, yet for the women themselves, they were simply another hazard to navigate in an already dangerous profession. The rescue homes, run by charitable organizations, multiplied. In these years, offering shelter, training in domestic work, and moral instruction to women willing to renounce their old lives. While some women genuinely benefited from the stability and education these homes provided, others found the environment stifling and hypocritical. Strict rules governed every aspect of behavior. Prayer at set hours, modest clothing restricted, reading material, and no contact with friends from the outside world. The aim was not merely to offer shelter, but to reshape identity, to turn an independent if stigmatized worker into a compliant servant, ideally placed in a respectable household, far from the temptations of the city. Many women ran away within weeks, preferring the uncertainty of the streets to the suffocating moral discipline of the homes. This revolving door between the underworld and the charitable sphere became a point of quiet frustration for reformers, who could not understand why their rescued women so often chose to return to what the reformers saw as degradation. The truth was simple. The trade, for all its dangers, offered a degree of agency that charity rarely matched. Economic realities compounded these choices. The years leading up to the First World War saw both rising rents and fluctuating employment. Opportunities for working-class women. Domestic service, still the largest employer of women, paid meager wages and offered little personal freedom. Factory work was demanding and often seasonal, leaving women without a steady income for months at a time. In this context, prostitution, whether full-time or occasional, remained one of the few ways a woman could quickly earn enough to pay for her lodging, clothing, and food without answering to an employer. The arrival of new leisure industries, from seaside resorts to picture houses, created fresh opportunities to meet clients discreetly, further blurring the line between socializing and solicitation. The police could not be everywhere at once, and in the anonymity of a darkened cinema or a crowded pier, arrangements could be made with minimal risk of detection. Yet the tightening net of regulation was inescapable in the long run. Brothels faced heavier penalties, forcing many to close or operate under even greater secrecy. This pushed more women onto the streets or into informal arrangements with clients, a shift that paradoxically made their work more visible and therefore more vulnerable to policing. In some districts, the closure of established brothels increased violence against women, as the informal street market lacked the protective structure and surveillance that madams and their staff once provided. The reformers had envisioned a moral victory in shuttering the dens of vice, but the reality was a scattered, more dangerous trade, harder to monitor and easier for predatory men to exploit. When war broke out in 1914, the government's attitude toward prostitution underwent a dramatic shift. The primary concern was no longer the moral health of the nation, but the physical health of its soldiers. Venereal disease was seen as a threat to military readiness, and sudden outbreaks among troops stationed in training camps or garrison towns triggered panic at the highest levels. Military authorities worked with local police to clamp down on sex work near bases, imposing curfews, conducting mass medical examinations, and even interning women suspected of infecting soldiers. The Contagious Diseases Acts, repealed decades earlier after fierce feminist opposition, seemed to be revived in spirit if not in name, as wartime necessity overrode peacetime principles. Women caught in these sweeps were subjected to invasive examinations and, if found infected, detained in hospital wards under guard until deemed clean. For some women, the war brought an increase in business soldiers flush with pay, eager for distraction before shipping off to the front, could be generous customers. For others, the heightened surveillance and the risk of detention made the work untenable. A few tried to reinvent themselves as entertainers in soldiers' canteens or as dance partners in military clubs, finding ways to maintain a connection to paying male company without crossing the line into prosecutable behavior. But the boundaries were porous, and rumor alone could be enough to draw the attention of the authorities. Wartime policing was less about building evidence than about neutralizing perceived threats to military efficiency. And in such a climate, a woman's reputation could be destroyed overnight. In the shadows of this wartime moral regime, the older networks of organized crime adapted once again. Gangs learned to exploit the chaos, providing forged identity papers to women, evading medical inspections, or arranging discreet transport to towns where enforcement was lighter. Some even leveraged connections with military suppliers or black market traders to set up private parties for officers, where the risk of police interference was minimal. These gatherings became legendary in certain circles, nights of champagne, jazz records, and fleeting intimacies conducted under the flicker of gaslight, far from the eyes of moral guardians. But such spaces were fragile, existing only so long, as they remained hidden, and a single informant could bring them crashing down. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, public patience for indulgence wore thin. The rhetoric of sacrifice, of shared suffering for the national cause, made any form of visible pleasure seem suspect, even unpatriotic. Women in the trade found themselves accused not merely of moral corruption, but of undermining the war effort, a charge that carried both legal and social consequences. And yet, in private, the demand for their company remained steady proof, perhaps of the enduring gap between public morality and private desire. By the time the war ended, the landscape of prostitution in Britain had been irrevocably altered. The combination of moral reform, police regulation, and wartime controls had fragmented the old networks, scattered the women into smaller, more precarious arrangements, and deepened the social stigma attached to their work. The interwar years would bring new challenges: economic depression, shifting sexual attitudes, and the rise of modern mass media, which would both demonize and glamorize the figure of the prostitute in ways the Victorians could never have imagined. And in that shifting terrain, the women who had endured the long, contradictory moral battles of the Victorian age would find themselves facing yet another era of adaptation, where survival depended not just on cunning and resilience, but on navigating a world that was learning to police desire in ever more sophisticated ways. The aftermath of the Great War unfolded like the slow exhalation after years of tension. But for women in the sex trade, the peace did not bring relief so much as a reshuffling of the hazards they already knew. The roaring crowds that had filled the streets on Armistice Day were gone within weeks, replaced by queues for work, for food, for housing queues that seemed to stretch on forever in the cold gray mornings of post-war Britain. Soldiers returned to a homeland that felt both familiar and alien, carrying physical wounds and invisible scars that made them volatile companions. Many could not find work, and some drifted into the same underworld economies: gambling, petty, theft, black market trading that overlapped with prostitution's shadowy infrastructure. For women, this meant both opportunity and risk. A larger pool of potential clients, yes, but also a spike in violence from men who were quick to anger and slow to trust. Men who sometimes sought the company of a prostitute, less for pleasure than for a chance to vent the frustrations they dared not show elsewhere. The streets reflected these tensions in subtle ways, an edge to the voices in late-night bars, a readiness in the eyes of women to read danger in a man's gait before he even spoke. The interwar years became a paradoxical period for the trade. On one hand, the loosening of certain social norms created new spaces for women to solicit without the heavy cloak of Victorian hypocrisy. Jazz clubs, dance halls, and cabaret theaters proliferated in the cities, each with its own unwritten rules about who might meet whom and for what purpose. In these smoky, dimly lit rooms, a woman could pass as a companion or a dancing partner, her services negotiated in whispers during the clatter of glasses and the blare of brass instruments. On the other hand, the same period saw a rise in police surveillance, now aided by better record-keeping, faster communication between precincts, and a growing willingness to prosecute cases that would once have been ignored as part of urban life's ungovernable margins. A woman with an arrest on her record could find herself barred from entire neighborhoods, her face recognized by patrolling officers who knew every name on their vice lists. Technology also altered the texture of the work. Telephones, once rare, in working-class households became tools for discreet arrangements, allowing women to avoid streetwalking altogether. Some placed coded ads in personal columns, promising companionship or private receptions, while others relied on intermediaries to pass along their numbers only to trusted clients. This shift created a kind of pro-escort system, insulated from some of the dangers of public solicitation, but still vulnerable to police sting operations. The brothel, meanwhile, adapted to modernity by becoming more discreet, no more scarlet curtains or obvious entrances, but quiet terraced houses with nothing to distinguish them from the row except the frequency of their evening visitors. Inside, gramophones played the latest American records. Champagne was poured into mismatched crystal, and women dressed not in the flamboyant costumes of earlier decades, but in the sleek, angular fashions of the 1920s frocks that suggested sophistication rather than seduction. The legal climate, however, had grown less forgiving. The Criminal Law Amendment Acts remained in force, and new municipal bylaws gave local councils the power to shutter premises suspected of harboring prostitutes, often without requiring a conviction. Magistrates, many of whom prided themselves on their moral vigilance, issued binding-over orders that could force a woman to leave town entirely. In London, the Metropolitan Police Vice Squad became a specialized unit with informants scattered across the city's nightlife, from Soho's smoky cafes to the West End's fashionable clubs. For women who had survived the brutalities of the Victorian era, this new regime felt less overtly moralistic, but more professionally efficient in its suppression. A machine that treated them not as fallen souls to be redeemed, but as logistical problems to be managed. Yet amid these pressures, certain women flourished. Those with the right mix of discretion, charm, and reliable clients could earn sums that rivaled or exceeded the wages of respectable professions. A skilled courtesan might secure the patronage of a wealthy businessman, an aging aristocrat, or even a foreign diplomat, providing not just sexual companionship, but the illusion of intimacy, the performance of a relationship that gave her stability without the confinements of marriage. In these arrangements, money often flowed in the form of gifts, jewelry, clothing, rent payments, rather than wages, providing a veneer of legitimacy that could be useful if questions were asked. Some even cultivated small salons in there, flats where artists, actors, and intellectuals mingled over wine and cigarettes. The line between socializing and solicitation deliberately blurred. These spaces were safer, though not immune to betrayal, and they depended entirely on the hostess's ability to manage her clientele without letting rivalries or police attention spiral out of control. The economic crash of 1929 dealt a shattering blow to this fragile equilibrium. Overnight, many wealthy patrons found their fortunes diminished or destroyed, and the trickle-down effect on the sex trade was immediate. Women who had relied on a handful of high-paying clients now found themselves competing with an influx of newcomers, respectable women who had lost husbands, jobs, or homes in the collapse and saw few other ways to survive. This sudden increase in supply drove prices down and desperation up. Street walking surged, and with it came heightened tensions with the police, who responded by tightening patrols and making more arrests. Newspapers, always eager for a moral scandal, began to run stories about the respectable women driven, into vice by the Depression, using their plight to sell papers while offering little in the way of sympathy for those who'd been in the trade all along. In these lean years, the underworld adapted once more. Pimps, now styling themselves as agents or protectors, offered women a degree of safety in exchange for a cut of their earnings, though in practice, this often meant violent control and exploitation. Brothels shifted toward mixed use. Properties, boarding houses that rented rooms by the week to traveling salesmen or seamen, with a quiet understanding that some tenants offered companionship for a price. Others went mobile, meeting clients in rented hotel rooms or even in motorcars parked in secluded lanes, a trend that alarmed the authorities for its elusiveness. The anonymity of these encounters made them harder to trace, but also more dangerous, as women were far from any familiar territory. If a client turned violent, the 1930s also brought new moral crusades, this time couched in the language of public health rather than religion. Venereal disease remained a concern, and the government began funding public awareness campaigns that warned of the dangers of casual sex. Posters in clinics and public lavatories depicted gaunt, hollow-eyed figures alongside slogans urging men to keep clean and avoid loose women. The implication was clear. Prostitutes were not merely immoral, but infectious vectors of disease who threatened the body politic as much as its soul. For the women themselves, this renewed stigmatization added another layer of difficulty in finding clients, as even those willing to pay might hesitate under the weight of such propaganda. Yet the trade endured, as it always had, adapting to each new wave of oppression with resourcefulness born of necessity. Women shared information about dangerous clients, pooled money for bail, and maintained informal support networks that cut across class and nationality. In the smoky back rooms of cafes or over whispered conversations in market stalls, they traded tips about which neighborhoods were safest this week, which magistrates were most lenient, which policemen might be open to persuasion. It was a world that operated on memory and rumor, where survival depended on knowing not just how to please, but how to vanish, how to change your name, your hairstyle, your entire route to work overnight, if the situation demanded it. As the decade drew to a close and Europe slid toward another catastrophic war, the women who had navigated these turbulent years found themselves on the brink of yet another transformation. The looming conflict promised to remake the moral and economic order once again, to open new opportunities while closing old ones, to tighten controls in the name of national defense, just as it had in 1914. They could not know exactly what form these changes would take, only that they would come quickly and with little regard for the lives they disrupted. For those still working the streets, the music of the dance halls and the hum of late-night traffic carried a strange, anticipatory note, as if the city itself were holding its breath. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, the machinery of mobilization reached into every corner of British life, and the sex trade was no exception. Blackouts darkened the cities, masking not only the skyline from enemy bombers, but also the faces of men and women meeting in shadowed doorways. In London, the wail of the air raid siren became as common a background to whispered negotiations as the clink of coins. And some women joked grimly that the sound was almost like a church bell calling them to work. Wartime upheaval brought an influx of uniformed men, British soldiers on leave. American G is once the United States entered the war. Canadian and Australian troops passing through on their way to the front, each with money in their pockets, varying degrees of loneliness, and a willingness to pay for company. In the pubs and dance halls that stayed open despite rationing, the sight of khaki and navy blue, mingling with bright lipstick and borrowed perfume, became as emblematic of wartime Britain as ration books and barrage balloons. The government, conscious of the potential for venereal disease to cripple fighting strength, launched an aggressive campaign to control the spread of infections among servicemen. Posters warned soldiers that a few minutes' pleasure may mean months of pain, and lectures on sexual hygiene became as much a part of training as rifle drills. Medical inspections were routine for troops returning from leave, and in certain towns, particularly port cities like Portsmouth and Southampton, military police were given broad authority to question and detain women suspected of soliciting near bases. This created a tense cat-and-mouse game between sex workers and the authorities, with women developing coded signals to warn each other of patrols, and certain sympathetic bartenders or doormen serving as unofficial lookouts. Still, the demand was too great for policing to suppress entirely, and some officers quietly preferred that their men find companionship with local women rather than engage in riskier or more scandalous behavior. The blackout itself reshaped the geography of the trade. With streetlights extinguished, narrow alleys and quiet bombed-out corners became prime meeting spots, though they also carried heightened danger. Darkness concealed both client and predator, and a woman had to rely on voice, gait, and instinct to judge whether a man could be trusted. Some adapted by arranging liaisons indoors, using private rooms in boarding houses or rented flats, whose owners were willing to overlook the law in exchange for a portion of the fee. In these makeshift brothels, blackout curtains hung thick and heavy, muting both light and sound, while a gramophone played to mask the distant thud of bombs. A single night could bring a mix of laughter, whispered confidences, and sudden terror if an air raid forced everyone into the shelter before business was concluded. American G is introduced a new dynamic to the trade, flush with pay far higher than that of British soldiers, and armed with coveted goods like nylon stockings, cigarettes, and chocolate. They could offer luxuries otherwise unobtainable under rationing. For some women, this meant a chance to secure not just cash, but also barterable items, which could be sold or traded in the underground economy for clothing, rent, or food. These relationships sometimes evolved into ongoing arrangements, with a GI visiting the same woman each time he was in town, bringing small gifts or letters between visits. But cultural differences also caused friction. Some G is carried with them American racial attitudes that clashed sharply with British norms, leading to disputes when they sought partners of different races. In certain towns, interracial liaisons drew police attention more quickly than the act of solicitation itself, a reminder that morality laws often served as a cover for policing social boundaries. Bombing raids altered patterns yet again. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, displacing both residents and the spaces where the trade had once flourished. In the East End, women who had worked the same corner for years found themselves navigating streets where landmarks were. Gone in danger came not just from the police, but from falling masonry or unexploded ordnance. Yet in the chaos, opportunity emerged. The dislocation allowed some women to move into new areas without the stigma of a known face, and the constant movement of people blurred the lines of jurisdiction, making it harder for local police to keep tabs. In the shelters, particularly the cavernous tunnels of the London Underground repurposed for civilian refuge, Strangers huddled together in darkness for hours at a time. These cramped, fearful spaces became breeding grounds for both genuine intimacy and opportunistic arrangements, whispered in the dark between the sounds of distant gunfire. The war also drew more women into the trade out of necessity. Conscription for women, introduced in 1941, meant many took up work in factories, agriculture, or the auxiliary services, but wages were low, and for those supporting children or elderly parents, extra income was essential. Night shifts in munitions, plants or long hours in the Women's Land Army often ended with exhausted bodies, but still left a gap between pay and survival. For some, the quickest way to fill that gap was to accept the proposition of a soldier in the pub or a dock worker just paid in cash. This blurring of lines between respectable working women supplementing their income and full-time sex. Workers complicated enforcement, as the same woman might be making shells by day and selling companionship by night without thinking of herself as a prostitute. Morale was a constant concern for the authorities, and prostitution was both condemned and quietly tolerated as a necessary outlet for men under extreme stress. In some military circles, particularly among officers, arrangements with certain women were tacitly accepted, provided they were discreet and avoided scandal. There were even instances of regular girls being unofficially attached to units, treated with a mix of respect and possessiveness by soldiers who saw them as part of the battalion's extended family. These relationships could provide a measure of protection for the women involved, but they also bound them to the fortunes of the unit. When it shipped out, they lost not only income, but the safety of familiar faces by the later years of the YA. War, rationing and shortages had grown severe, and the black market flourished. Sex became another commodity in this economy, exchanged for goods as often as for cash. A night with a soldier might be worth a pair of boots, a week's worth of meat, or enough tea and sugar to make a family's rations stretch. This barter system tied the trade more deeply into the fabric of wartime survival, making it less about indulgence and more about subsistence. Yet even in this pragmatic mode, there were moments of tenderness. Shared cigarettes in a bomb shelter, a soldier pressing a photograph into a woman's hand with a promise to return, a fleeting sense of being seen and valued amid the anonymity of war. As 1945 approached and victory seemed near, some women began to plan for the return of peace. They imagined leaving the trade, perhaps marrying a returning soldier or finding work in the industries that had sustained them during the war. But others, knowing too well the cycles of economic boom and bust, prepared instead for the lean years they suspected would follow. They remembered the Depression after the last war, the sudden drying up of patronage, the crackdown by authorities eager to reassert peacetime morality. In whispered conversations in pubs and over tea in cramped flats, they discussed which neighborhoods might stay friendly, which police inspectors might be bribed, and whether the Americans would linger long enough to keep the market buoyant. The end of the war brought jubilation to the streets, but beneath the celebrations was the quiet reshuffling of lives. For some women, the trade had been a temporary expedient, and they stepped away with relief. For others, it remained the only reliable means of support. The war had changed the business in ways that would not be undone. The habits of discretion, the use of private arrangements, the reliance on barter, and the presence of foreign clients had all left their mark. The question now was whether these adaptations could withstand the new pressures of peace, or whether a fresh wave of moral reform, like those that had swept through after every major conflict, would try to drive them back into the shadows once more. The end of the Second World War in 1945 was heralded by dancing in the streets, bonfires in city squares, and the unbridled relief of a people who had endured 6 years of danger, deprivation, and uncertainty. But for those in the sex trade, victory also brought a new kind of reckoning. The steady influx of uniformed clients, British, American, Canadian, Polish. Free French dwindled almost overnight as servicemen were demobilized and sent home. Some returned to wives and sweethearts they had left behind, while others carried the scars of war in ways that made them seek solitude rather than company. The streets and pubs that had thrummed with wartime commerce grew quieter, and women who had built an income on soldiers' pay found themselves staring into the chasm of peacetime economics, where work was harder to come by and competition in their line of trade intensified. The British government, eager to reassert control over morality after years of necessary leniency, began cracking down on what officials termed wartime vice. The same streets that had been informally tolerated for the sake of the troops were suddenly patrolled by police with a renewed zeal, spurred on by a public narrative that equated post-war reconstruction with moral purification. In cities like London, Liverpool, and Glasgow, brothels that had survived the Blitz were raided and shuttered, and landlords who had once discreetly rented rooms to working women found themselves facing fines or even prison. Magistrates handed down sentences with the stern rhetoric of a country trying to cleanse itself of wartime laxity, often ignoring the economic realities that had driven women into the trade in the first place. The wartime network's bartenders, boarding house owners, lookouts were fractured, some scattering into other forms of illicit trade, others retiring entirely. For many women, the end of the war meant returning to the margins, relying on fewer, more dangerous clients, or seeking work in factories, shops, or domestic service, jobs that were poorly paid and carried their hazards. The returning soldiers, meanwhile, presented a complicated new clientele. Some had romanticized the women they had known during the war, imagining them as glamorous companions in a city under siege, and sought to find them again. But others carried the bitterness of men who felt they had been taken advantage of when lonely and far from home, and their resentment often turned into public scorn. Newspapers stoked the idea that wartime prostitutes were profiteers who had exploited the sacrifices of fighting men. This narrative ignored the fact that many of these women had endured bombings, rationing, and personal losses just as civilians had, and that their work had, in its way, been a part of the war effort keeping morale intact, offering human connection. In an era when tomorrow was never promised, economic hardship persisted despite the supposed peace dividend. Rationing continued well into the 1950s, and jobs for women were scarce. For widows of the war and single mothers, prostitution remained one of the few ways to make ends meet, but the tone of the trade had shifted. The camaraderie and mutual support that had characterized much of the wartime trade gave way to a harsher competition as women fought over fewer clients in an environment of increased police surveillance. The shift from public solicitation to more covert arrangements accelerated, with women arranging meetings through intermediaries or in private clubs under the guise of hostesses. This transition mirrored the broader changes in British society, where the black market of wartime gave way to the gray market of post-war reconstruction, still illicit, but more layered, more hidden. American GIS, now fewer in number, but still stationed in certain bases, maintained a niche demand. Some women who had formed attachments during the war married their GI partners and emigrated to the United States, often finding that the promise of a new life came with its constraints and prejudices. Others kept their transatlantic relationships purely transactional, exchanging letters and photographs for money or goods sent from across the ocean. But for most, the trade became increasingly local again, rooted in the rhythms of British working-class life. Port cities remained hubs, with sailors from all over the world providing a trickle of income, but even here, the decline from wartime levels was sharp and unmistakable. Meanwhile, Parliament took a renewed interest, cleaning up the streets. Debates in the House of Commons framed prostitution not as a symptom of economic hardship, but as a moral failing. with calls for stricter laws echoing the campaigns of the Victorian social purity movements. This attitude ignored the structural poverty and limited opportunities that kept women in the trade, framing them instead as a moral contagion to be eradicated. Some reformers, however, quietly acknowledged that the old model of policing harassment, imprisonment, forced relocation had failed to eliminate the trade, and instead proposed measures like regulated toleration zones or increased access to health care. These ideas rarely made it into policy, but they hinted at a growing divide between those who saw sex work as inherently criminal and those who saw it as a form of labor that required different forms of oversight. In the private spaces of the trade, adaptation was constant. Women relied more heavily on regular clients, cultivating relationships that blurred the lines between business and companionship. This not only offered a measure of security, but also reduced the risk of arrest, as fewer public solicitations meant fewer encounters with undercover officers. In certain working-class neighborhoods, the presence of a discreet sex worker was quietly accepted, even appreciated, if she was seen as one of our own and respected unspoken boundaries. The role of madams became more important as they acted as gatekeepers, matchmakers, and protectors, charging a fee for arranging safe introductions. Some of these madams were themselves former sex workers who had aged out of the trade, but retained the networks and street sense needed to navigate the post-war climate. There was also the lingering trauma of the war itself, which shaped both clients and workers in profound ways. Men returned from battlefields with physical injuries, emotional scars, and altered desires, some seeking tenderness, others seeking to recreate the intensity of wartime life through risky encounters. Women who had lived through years of bombings, sudden loss, and constant uncertainty often found themselves emotionally distanced from their work, adopting a professional detachment that was as much a survival strategy as it was a business practice. Conversations in dimly lit rooms sometimes veered into territory neither party had intended. Soldier recounting a comrade's death at Arnhem, a woman describing the night her home was destroyed in the Blitz moments were the transactional. Veneer thinned and the shared humanity beneath was briefly visible. As the 1950s progressed, Britain entered a period of cultural change. Rock and roll blared from jukeboxes. Teenagers with pocket money spent freely, and the rigid hierarchies of wartime began to loosen. For some sex workers, this meant new opportunities to cater to a younger, freer-spending clientele, while for others, it meant increased competition from younger women entering the trade. The shift in fashion, from the structured elegance of the 1940s to the more casual, rebellious look of the late 1950s, was reflected in the trade as well gone were. The days when a woman might dress in her finest for the street. Now, she might wear tight trousers and a leather jacket, blending in with the crowds until she made her approach. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent modernity, old dangers remained. Police raids continued, and public shaming in the press was still a powerful weapon against those caught. The stigma of sex work, reinforced by centuries of moral condemnation, did not vanish with changing fashions. Women still risked losing their lodgings, their children, and their reputations if exposed, and many lived with the constant tension of balancing visibility for clients with invisibility from the law. In this fragile equilibrium, the lessons of the Victorian-era adaptation, discretion, the importance of networks remained as relevant as ever, and as Britain edged toward the social revolutions of the 1960s, with their promises of liberation and equality, those in the trade could not help but wonder, would the coming decade bring genuine change for them, or merely a new set of dangers under the guise of progress? The answer would be shaped not only by shifts in law and culture, but by the enduring resilience of women who had navigated every upheaval from the smog-choked streets of Victorian London to the rubble of the Blitz, and who knew that survival in their world had never depended on the times being kind, only on their ability to endure and adapt. By the time the 1960s arrived, Britain was a country in flux. The rigid moral codes that had defined Victorian England and persisted, with only slight loosening, through 2 world wars were being challenged in every arena: music, fashion, politics, race, gender, and sexuality. The old order was crumbling, and for those in the sex trade, the changes brought both unprecedented freedoms and unfamiliar perils. The Cultural Revolution was loud and visible: skirts shorter, hair longer, and voices bolder. Yet beneath the swinging London headlines and the glamour of Carnaby Street, the quieter and more enduring story of women in the trade continued to unfold in the shadows, informed by the same economic pressures, social stigmas, and human complexities that had shaped their lives since the gaslit days of the 19th century. The repeal of certain archaic laws, the loosening of censorship, and a more open public conversation about sexuality created a climate in which sex was increasingly commodified in ways that blurred the boundaries between entertainment and prostitution. Soho's streets, once dim warrens of backrooms and curtained windows, now flashed with neon signs for strip clubs, continental cinemas, and hostess bars. For some women, this was liberation of a kind work could be conducted under the cover of legitimate businesses, giving a layer of protection from street arrests. For others, it meant the erosion of the small protections the old systems had offered, as organized crime tightened its grip on the more profitable corners of the trade. The clientele, too, had changed. The post-war years had brought immigration from across the Commonwealth, reshaping the face of Britain's cities. In ports and industrial centers, sailors from the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia joined the steady flow of American tourists, European businessmen, and homegrown clientele. This diversity broadened the market, but also intensified the competition, as women from varied backgrounds brought different languages, styles, and networks into play. The trade adapted with the times. Advertisements discreetly placed in underground, magazines, coded messages in Lonely Hearts columns, and word-of-mouth networks that now spanned ethnic communities as well as geographic neighborhoods. Yet the stigma endured. The feminist movements of the decade were themselves divided over sex work. Some saw it as a form of patriarchal exploitation to be abolished, while others argued for the agency of women to choose their economic paths. Sex workers themselves were rarely invited into these debates. Their voices, as in Victorian times, were more often spoken about than spoken with. Health became a more visible issue during these years. The medical advances of the mid-20th century brought more reliable contraception, antibiotics for venereal diseases, and the gradual destigmatization of sexual health clinics. For the first time in decades, women could take some control over their reproductive futures and their physical well-being without relying on dangerous, clandestine remedies. This shift was transformative. The fear of pregnancy, a constant shadow in the Victorian trade, could be managed with greater certainty, allowing women to make once unimaginable choices. Yet the state's approach remained inconsistent health. Services could offer treatment in one breath and moral condemnation in the next. Many women still avoided clinics, wary of being reported to the police or having their details recorded in ways that might follow them for life. Meanwhile, the economic undercurrents that had always driven the trade persisted. The 1960s celebrated. Prosperity did not reach every corner of Britain. In working-class districts, where jobs were scarce, housing was poor, and wages were stagnant, prostitution remained one of the few ways a woman could support herself independently. Some entered the trade temporarily to bridge a gap between jobs or to cover an urgent expense. Others stayed for years, finding that the flexibility, however dangerous, outweighed the monotony and meager pay of factory or service work. The archetype of the fallen woman which had haunted Victorian moral imagination, was slowly being replaced by a more pragmatic public image, though one still tinged with judgment. The woman in the trade was now as likely to be seen as a calculating professional as a victim. Yet in either framing, she remained an outsider to respectable society. The law lagged behind social change. Street solicitation was still heavily policed, and raids on suspected brothels continued to make headlines. The Sexual Offenses Act of 1956 and later amendments sought to regulate the trade without outright legalizing it, resulting in a murky system where certain acts were tolerated behind closed doors but criminalized in public. This ambiguity was in practice a tool of selective enforcement. Those without resources or connections bore the brunt of arrests, while more organized operations could often negotiate with or simply evade the authorities. As had been the case in the Victorian era, discretion and connections could mean the difference between survival and ruin. And yet, for all the change, the echoes of the 19th century were everywhere. The same whispered transactions in lodging houses, the same careful cultivation of regular clients, the same mixture of risk and resourcefulness defined the day-to-day reality of the trade. Women still had to weigh every choice whether to approach a man, to trust a landlord, to work with a madam, to step into a car against the possible cost in money, safety, and reputation. The line between independence and exploitation was as fine as ever dot by the close of the decade. Britain had become a more openly sexual society in image, yet the lived reality for sex workers remained one of negotiation, resilience, and invisibility. The forgotten life of prostitutes in Victorian England was not, in truth, forgotten at all. It had merely evolved, adapted, and re-emerged in new forms, carried forward by women whose stories were still rarely written down. From the gin-soaked alleys of 1860s Whitechapel to the neon-lit clubs of 1960s Soho, the trade had survived every attempt to suppress it, shaped by economic necessity, human desire, and the quiet ingenuity of those who lived it. Their experiences bridged centuries, a lineage of survival hidden in plain sight. And while historians might one day gather the fragments court records, newspaper clippings, whispered family anecdotes into a coherent narrative, the truest record would always live in the unrecorded moments. A nod between women on the street, a client's footsteps fading into the night, the silent calculations made behind a glance dot in the end. A Victorian prostitute's life was never wholly consigned to the past. It lingered, refracted through changing fashions, shifting laws, and evolving public morals, yet always recognizable. To walk those streets, then or now, was to see the continuity, the way survival wore different clothes, but kept the same eyes. And perhaps, in the quiet persistence of their trade, there lay a truth that neither moral reformers nor lawmakers could erase, that where there is desire, there is commerce. Where there is commerce, there is adaptation. And where there is adaptation, there is life stubborn, unvarnished, and enduring, no matter the century.